What if Naruto summoned a dragon? Part 1. The first thing he was aware of was swirling darkness. It was odd because he'd never seen anything like this before in his dreams. For the first time since he started having these strange dreams, he seemingly was able to walk into and out of when he turned 10. Neil Foster, now 23, couldn't pull himself from this one. In the darkness, there were flashes of lightning, violet in color and menacing in nature. All the while he heard roars, shouts, and mutterings. Above other things, he saw strange rings floating around marked with strange symbols that he neither recognized yet at the same time his mind worked to identify them as if he'd seen them before. He was a young man who, in such a short amount of time, had seen much and wished he could forget half of it. His carefree days of sitting at home playing Dungeons and Dragons with his childhood friends ended after graduation from high school. He and his friends had enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard thinking it was a safer occupation than serving somewhere where you might get killed, wounded severely, or any other things. Like Danny. Danny Foster, callsign Rocker, was Neil's older brother and a Marine fighter pilot. He piloted the new state-of-the-art F-35 jet fighters off a carrier overseas. On August 6th, he had spoken to his brother about his desire to enlist, and his brother had told him to try the Marines or the Navy. That way they'd have a chance of serving together. The next day, 2 Marines came to his house to inform him and his mother that while on a ground support mission on a classified operation, First Lieutenant Daniel Foster's plane disappeared from all radar in the area. For the moment he was listed as MIA, but that didn't last long. The following morning, search crews found wreckage scattered from one side of the desert to the other, all indications of some sort of explosion. No body was recovered. That had been 6 years ago. Neil didn't give up on learning to fly though. A few college courses he had learned enough that, once he joined the CG, he was assigned as a chopper co-pilot. That ended on the 5th anniversary of Danny's death, as on a training exercise, the chopper began to go out of control and crashed in the Gulf of Mexico. Neil's 2 friends out of high school had been his crew on the chopper. He'd fought to keep them alive, but it was no use. He himself had badly broken his leg and also broke a hip. The doc said he could recover well enough, but the psychological aspect of it had seen him refrain from getting back into a chopper, and also the guilt at being able to do nothing to save his friends was enough that, after a few weeks' recovery, he was granted a hardship discharge from the CG. He'd been a civilian for 2 weeks before landing a job as a crop duster. Flying a beat-up old biplane that may or may not have been leftover from the First World War to dust crops was nowhere near comparable to flying choppers, but, still, the old plane did have some merits. He actually started preferring the plane over a chopper. It wasn't long before he started pushing himself and soon started performing stunts for air shows on the side of crop dusting. As Neil's dream faded from soaring above the clouds, having discovered a love of fixed-wing aircraft, he always dreamed of being a pilot in the Great War, pursuing the Red Baron and other great aces of the bygone era. To the malevolent storm, this time, the voices were clearer than before. "We must do something. Malfoy cannot be allowed to get his claws on Dash." Yes, I know. Believe me, I know. The magic, it must be sent somewhere, but that's just it, where? It would have to be a place or plane in which Malfoy can never get it, perhaps even another world. Aha! I know just where to send it. A crack of thunder pierced the sky and the voices changed. "Shadra, I have a mission for you." "Anything, Lord Malfoy." "Does Cinder require my aid in gathering the Guardian's powers?" "No. She is doing everything exactly as I wish done." "No. I need you to seek out a powerful spellcaster called the Forger and bring him, or her, before me. The mages who guard such magic have sent it somewhere. I will have that power." "It will be as you command, Master." Another burst of thunder, followed by a cry of rage that nearly deafened him. "You cannot defeat me. I am eternal." Then the clouds seemed to back away, turning from dark violet to soft, royal purple. Shadra. Malfor is gone. You don't need to fight for him anymore. You are wrong, Cinder. He is merely sealed away. Once I find the forger, I will be able to make him craft a device or spell to free him. Spyro. Help me stop her. I can't see why my powers have yet to return. What is this forger she spoke of? I don't know. I wish Ignitus were here. If anyone would know, he would. The clouds lost the purple light and instead morphed into pillars of gray stone that seemed to then form a great library of some sort. Shocked at the sudden change of his dream, he turned around and bumped into a teal-scaled dragon who glanced down at him at first with shock and then with kindness. So, here's where they hid you. They were wise to do so. Neil gaped at the dragon. Who are you? And what do you mean here's where they hid me? This is a dream. It has to be. The dragon snorted. I understand your confusion. Crossing the planes of existence from one to another is no simple feat to have accomplished so. You must have cleansed your mind of all things to do with your abilities, lest your curiosity drive you to replicating the magic used to send you here and returning prematurely. Suddenly, more runes appeared about Neil, and this time the symbols within started to squirm and mesh until, much to his shock, he could read them. The dragon nodded. Your mind has begun to awaken. Good. I fear that your time in this other plane is coming to an end. Neil Foster, though you are human, you bear within you magic from this world. As such, I have your book here as well as the Book of Foresight. It says here that, if you ignore me now and go up in your plane tomorrow, you will suffer the same fate as your brother. The engine will seize and you will die. However, if you come with me, you will live. I cannot guarantee a better life, but, as you have nothing here to hold you back anymore, perhaps you would care for one more adventure. Or perhaps, an adventure that is actually real and not imaginary. Neil didn't want to believe the dragon. He made a habit of going over the old crate every day to make sure nothing happened when he was up there. Then again, he had heard that oftentimes planes with perfect maintenance records often crashed due to unexplainable problems. He had no family left, no friends. Why face a future that may or may not see him rise the next day? He turned to the dragon and nodded. The dragon in turn smiled. Now then, I seem to have neglected to introduce myself. I am Ignitus, former guardian of fire, now chronicler of the new age. And you, Neil Foster, are what we know as a forger, one who can use magic to summon inanimate objects into reality. Normally, forgers are limited to what we know of in our world, but, given that you have spent so much time in that world, you doubtlessly know a few things from that world as well. Neil nodded. Are there limitations? Ignitus nodded. Yes, you can only forge summon things that you know how they work. Let me see. Here's an example using something from your world. If you know how one of these automobiles works, you can forge summon it to use. On the other hand, if you don't know how something works, you cannot create it. Neil nodded. Okay, so no creating space shuttles, nuclear reactors, cruise ships, aircraft carriers, lightsabers, androids, or laser rifles. Ignitus looked to him curiously. Lightsabers? How can light be a saber? Neil chuckled. It's something from this world. I will refrain from making a Star Wars joke. Ignitus chuckled good-naturedly. I suppose that's for the best. Now then, I suppose I'd best warn you, while we've been talking, I've been using magic to open a portal and bring you to this realm. Hence the reason our conversations are growing clearer. Now, when you awake, I would suggest you head for the city of Warfang. Once there, find 2 dragons, Spyro and Cinder. They'll be able to protect you from those who want to use your powers for evil. Neil shuddered, remembering the dream. Shadra. Ignitus nodded. Yes, like Cinder, she was corrupted by Malfoy and still serves him, even though he is gone. She'll stop at nothing to capture you and force you to create something that can break the crystal and free Malfoy. I also would suggest that once you awake, you should test your abilities by forged summoning a few things, clothes, armor, maybe a weapon or two. Something that you know how to use. Neil nodded but then turned back. Wait, how do I forge summon? Ignitus chuckled as the vision faded. You'll know. Those who have had your magic before always seem to figure out how to do it from the start. Just picture it in your mind and think on the basic parts that make it what it is. Neil awoke with a start in a field of bright yellow flowers. He gazed around and saw nothing and no one near him and shrugged. Well, there are worse places to awaken. Neil then remembered Ignitus' advice and, seeing that he was still in his sleeping clothes, closed his eyes and visualized something familiar. Immediately, he started piecing together the costume he'd worn to a Comic-Con several years ago back in high school. It was a black shirt, black jeans, military boots, police-issue riot armor, and a gray leather trench coat. When he opened his eyes, he found the items laying neatly spread out before him along with a large book that wasn't there before. Opening it, he saw a ghostly quill appear and then gawked in amazement as the book started writing itself. The heading was Class 0 Forged Summons. Immediately, his clothes and armor appeared as if sketched into the book along with what they were made of and what made them special. Ranger Tactical Armor. Capable of stopping low-caliber ballistic weapons and melee attacks, this armor is issued to veteran rangers who have served countless hours in the field. Helmet and gas mask not included. Neil then began to think of a weapon. For some reason, the day before he had spent his entire day off watching a World War I television special. His father had been a gun collector by hobby and had a little book he had carried with him with a list of firearms he'd wanted to own. At the top of the list for pistols had been a German Luger pistol. However, when Neil tried to visualize it, he found he was drawing a blank with something. A soft glow from the book got his attention and he turned to see a partially complete diagram of the Luger pistol as well as a note written in what looked to be an exact match to his father's hand. The Luger is possibly the most famous and recognizable pistol in the world, but for all its fame the weapon has a severe drawback of being mechanically complicated and difficult to produce in great quantities. Indeed, the diagram was missing a good portion of the receiver as well as the firing chamber, so Neil set the idea aside and then started thinking of another weapon. The next was another German pistol, the Mauser C96 broomhandle. This weapon, being somewhat simpler, began to be drawn in the book at the same time he was piecing it together in his mind. Then came the hurdle. Neil realized that he also had to create the ammunition that the pistol used and, knowing that a model had been made that used the 9mm round, decided on that. A soft hoof got his attention and a leather pistol belt housing a seemingly fresh from the factory C96 complete with 8 clips of 9mm ammunition was laying on the armor. Once this was done, Neil decided to go for a few more summons before departing. First, simply because walking around without something to cover his head in a seemingly medieval age didn't appeal to him, he forged summoned a World War I German coal scuttle helmet with no markings. Next, he created a knuckle duster which was the combination of a double-bladed knife, brass knuckles, and a steel spike pommel. Then, for a second sidearm, he forged an M19 11.45 Colt automatic, and then, for want of a longer-ranged weapon than the pistols, he started thinking about a rifle. This time, he had a strong memory. His father had lined up a man in Maine willing to trade an old rifle he'd found in a storage locker he'd bought for one of his father's revolvers. The guy dealt in handguns, so a rifle was of little use to him. The weapon was sight unseen, and the day it arrived Neil's father had nearly gone through the roof. There, in the weapon crate, was a Royal Army-issued 1916 Lee Enfield Mark III SMLE bolt-action rifle.
The .303 caliber beast had been difficult to restore to firing condition, and Neil remembered the rush of firing the rifle on the range that day and watching his father painstakingly break it down to clean and oil the parts. The sound of a heavy object landing nearby made him look, and again, he saw that what he had thought had been brought into real life. The rifle, complete with sling, bayonet, 5 sets of extra strip clips, and even a kit for mounting a scope were nearby. Neil reveled in his success, but was then aware of a great drain on his physical being, and he glanced to the book and saw it flip back to the very first page, the ghost quill reappear, and start writing. Nothing can be forged for free. There is a cost to what is created. Test your limits with a few basic summons, but wait until you become more skilled before tackling something more complex. A standard rule is that the more components or moving pieces, the greater the strain. It takes less energy and mana to create a sword or a bow than it does a catapult or a crossbow. Neil nodded and closed the book and found that a large army-style satchel had also been created nearby. As the weariness passed, he changed out of his sleeping clothes, donned the summoned clothes, armor, and weapons, and then, gazing around again, he sighed as he realized something. I didn't ask Ignitus how to get to Warfang. Neil was walking in the meadow for a good while now if his memory was accurate about solar positions. It seemed that there was yellow flowers for as far as the eye could see and a large mountain range beyond that. After stopping for a moment, Neil thought of something and opened the book. Since apparently the thing could read his mind, he started thinking of something. He remembered seeing Pirates of the Caribbean and saw Jack Sparrow's enchanted compass, which always pointed to what the holder desired most. He knew how compasses worked, but not the enchantment. He hoped that was enough, but when he opened his eyes, he saw the book flip to another page and start writing again. Forge summoning is the art of creating items from memory or from experimentation. While summoning mundane and everyday items is easy, an enchanted item cannot be forged because it's outside of a forger's power. To create an enchanted item, create the base item, in this case, a compass, and then proceed to the nearest magician's home, wizard's library, or sorcerer's tower and have them enchanted for you. Neil grunted. Well, that's helpful. The book made a footnote. You're welcome. With a snap, the book closed, allowing Neil to place it back in his pack. He sighed and then gazed around again. He then noticed the sun was starting to set and, as much as he liked camping, he decided it would be better to find some sort of civilization first rather than bunk down in an unknown land. Although he was pretty sure summoning a tent was within his means. He started off again and vaguely caught the sound of horns in the distance. He glanced to the west, was able to see downhill at several objects moving through the tall grass further down the plains. They looked to be giant monkeys of some sort, and they were astride large boars. He turned his glance ahead and saw what looked like a blur passing through the grass. Occasionally, something would fly up, arc, and then drop down onto the monkeys, and one would scream and fall, a feathery shaft protruding from its body. An archer. Well, I suppose this makes sense. Still, I wonder why he's being chased. Neil decided now was as good a time as ever and forged a pair of binoculars so that he could see clearer. There was apparently 13 of those mounted monkeys. Then he glanced at the archer and felt his jaw drop. He'd seen cheetahs before at the zoo, this one was anything but. It was upright on 2 legs, clad in light brown leather armor, had blue cloth binding the armor, and held what looked like an old Welsh longbow in its left hand, paw, and was drawing the string back for another shot. At that moment, something rustled behind him, and to Neil's shock the cheetah was tackled from behind by a dismounted monkey that had snuck up behind it. He then heard the monkeys laughing as they slowed, and what looked to be the leader of the troop advanced. The monkey spoke in loud, confident tones. It was no trouble for Neil to hear him, for the leader was definitely male judging by the tone of voice. So, we finally have you, the infamous Skylar of the Cheetah clan. You really thought you could free your fellows from Lady Shadra and there not be consequences?
She is pleasantly looking forward to torturing you for what you've done. Your insult to her warrants no lesser punishment. But first, I think I'll make sure that you can't run from us anymore, nor fight back, Since you won't be needing that bow anymore where you're going, perhaps your hand? And maybe a leg while we're on the subject of escape. The cheetah, Skylar, huffed. Do what you will. But know that even if I fall, I have still dealt a blow to Shadra and freed my people from her grasp. My fate is inconsequential. I accept that. So do your worst, ape. The leader snarled. Resilient to the last. All right, never mind Shadra torturing you. I'm sure she'll find other toys to amuse herself. With you, however, I think you need to be taken down a notch. I think perhaps, since you are a little taller than me, we should shorten you. Yes, I believe you to be at least a whole head taller. The ape drew a wicked-looking sword and prepared to deal the fatal blow. Neil reacted out of pure instinct and training, unslinging his rifle, chambering the first round, sighting, and then pulling the trigger. The report of the rifle shattered the calm like a thunderclap. There was a metallic clang, and the ape looked to see his sword shatter from the force of the bullet. He immediately started looking around for the source of the attack. Neil chambered another round, aimed and fired, this time striking the leader's boar mount in the flank and sending the creature into a frenzy, throwing the lead ape and charging at its own kind and running down 3 apes before vanishing in the tall grass. The leader looked up the hill and scowled. You there? Who the hell are you? Why are you interrupting me? You break my sword, scare my hog. Why'd you do that? What concern is this worthless cat to you? Neil suddenly had a flashback to an old Chuck Norris movie and smiled. This is J. McQuaid, Texas Ranger. The ape looked to his fellows who shrugged, and the leader looked back. Texas what? Neil groaned at that. The ape, still confused, then glared. Hey you, stand up so I can see you. Neil rose from his crouched position, standing up to his full height of 6'7". Almost at that moment, a gust of wind whipped by him, making the loose flaps of his gray trench coat start flapping. With the sun behind him, the apes had to squint to see him. Neil saw 2 of the apes go wide-eyed and turn to their leader, who just started, open-mouthed. One ape grabbed Skylar's bow and, perhaps acting out of instinct, drew the bow and loosed an arrow. However, it was all bravado, as the arrow was poorly aimed and embedded itself in the ground barely halfway up the hill. Neil grunted, hefted the rifle, aimed and fired. Unlike the ape, he didn't miss. The round flew true and struck the ape in the chest. The force of the round caving in the shoddy plate armor and knocking the ape backwards into the grass. This made the ape leader angry, and he started frothing from the mouth until finally he drew a dagger and held it to Skylar's throat. That's it. Drop your weapon and come down here now before I kill this miserable cat. I tell you I'll kill him. Right now, come down here. Neil glanced at Skylar, who seemed to have regained some hope. He set the rifle down and started down the hill. The ape leader smirked and snarled to his underlings. When he gets down here, take him from behind. I don't know who or what he is, but he'll make a fine toy for Shadra. The ape then looked as Neil came down and chuckled. Well now, what did you say you were again? A Texas Ranger? I can honestly say I've never seen one up close before. Neil caught the rustling behind him and gave a small smile. Well, you're in luck. 'Cause you're about to get an even closer look. The ape leader looked at Neil curiously before he opened the left side of his coat, where he kept both the knuckle duster and the bayonet for the rifle, produced the bayonet, and threw it like a throwing knife. The blade flew so fast the ape leader had no idea what he was reaching for until he felt a sharp pain in his exposed right shoulder and dropped the dagger. Looking at his shoulder, he saw a dagger far larger than the one he had been holding sticking out of his shoulder and started howling in apathy and rage. Following up the throwing attack,
Neil drew both the C-96 and the M1911 and simultaneously fired both right and left into the grass, killing the two apes who were about to try and take him from behind. He then leveled both pistols forward and glanced at Skylar. "Get down." Skylar dropped to the ground, prone, and Neil opened fire. The C-96, with its 9mm round, he used against the apes, as, with the exception of their leader, they had no armor. The M1911, with its larger .45 round, he used on the Boers as they tried to turn and attack. If the large round didn't kill them, it wounded them so badly that they at once decided they'd had enough and took off whether their riders wished it or not, though, given the successful attacks Neil was using, most of them were willing to flee. By the time he fired the last rounds from both pistols, the apes had fled, leaving their wounded leader and the dead behind them. As he holstered the pistols, the ape leader, realizing he was alone, turned and ran into the brush, screeching all the while as the bayonet jumped around in the wound. Neil closed with Skylar and, drawing the knuckle duster, undid his bindings before rising again. "You all right?" Skylar took a moment to check himself over before nodding. "I think so. Thank you for saving me." Neil nodded. "No problem. I have a feeling if the roles were reversed you'd have done the same." Skylar chuckled. "Indeed, although, probably in a less flashy fashion. I've never seen weapons like these before." "Where are you from?" Neil chuckled. "From a place far away from here. I was originally from Galveston, Texas. Then yesterday, something happened and I found myself here." Skylar nodded. "So, you said you are a Texas Ranger? Is that something special?" Neil chuckled. "Yeah, the Rangers are an important part of Texas, both in law enforcement and in baseball. Sadly, though, I just said that to try and unnerve that guy. You see, where I come from, no one messes with the Rangers, the law enforcement Rangers that is, and it's said that no one has ever harmed or killed a Texas Ranger and lived to tell it. I just forgot that I wasn't in Texas anymore. I mean, what does being a Texas Ranger mean to someone who isn't from where I'm from?" Skylar nodded understandingly. "So, if you're not a Ranger, what are you? You did say your name was J. something, right?" Neil chuckled. "Another Texas bit. Name's Neil. I'm a former pararescueman for the United States Coast Guard." Skylar nodded. "So, that's the truth?" Neil nodded. "Yep. Had a strange dream, turned into a vision, then a large teal dragon telling me to find, Spyro and Cinder, and that I was something called a forger." Skylar looked to him. "A forger? What's that?" Neil nodded and knelt to the ground, closed his eyes, and then pictured a replacement bayonet for the one he had lost. When he opened his eyes, the weapon was before him and Skylar was in awe. "Basically, it seems I can create objects out of thin air as long as I know what they're made of, how they work, or if I've used them before." Skylar nodded slowly before going to collect his bow and arrows. "If you're looking for Spyro and Cinder, the two heroes, you'll need to head east to Warfang. It's a few days' journey, but, as the sun is setting, and the plains aren't safe to travel at night, I'll escort you to my village and you'll be able to spend the night and get some provisions for your journey there. Plus, with Hunter being appointed as the clan's representative to the city, we have a scrying pool that lets us send messages back and forth. You'll need to ask Chief Prowless first before you can use it, though." Neil nodded. "Much obliged to you. Just let me collect my gear and then we'll be off." As Neil trudged back up the hill, the book suddenly felt warm. He opened it and saw it writing, rather angrily, "Be careful who you tell your abilities to. The ancients sacrificed much to keep forge magic out of the hands of those who would use it for evil. You never know who else may be listening or scrying you." Neil nodded and closed the book as he reached the place he had set down his rifle and cursed angrily.
Where he had left his rifle was nothing but trampled grass and a set of ape-like footprints walking away. "Neil? What's wrong?" Neil turned to Skylar. "One of those apes must have been playing dead. It got my rifle." Skylar paled. "Can they use it? Make more of those weapons?" Neil shrugged. "I don't know. I hope not. Either way, they probably lack what they need to make the weapons by hand anyway. I'll just forge a new one when I have the time." Skylar nodded. "Well, no time like the present. Besides, I'm a bit curious to know a little more about these weapons of yours. Can they be used for hunting?" Neil nodded. "They can. My race has used firearms for everything from hunting to protecting to exploring to warfare for almost 500 years. It's only in the last 200 or so that firearms have really advanced." Skylar looked to him. "How so?" "About 400 years ago, in my world, the standard firearm was called the smoothbore musket. It was a weapon that fired only a single shot, wasn't very accurate, and was held to reload. Here, let me show you." Neil thought back to seeing a rifle at the Springfield Armory Museum and forged the 1795 flintlock musket. He held the weapon for Skylar to see and nodded. "That's a musket. For 2 centuries, this was the type of weapon used from everything from hunting to warfare. Soldiers would line up in ranks and fire volleys into the enemy ranks. The muskets weren't accurate at range, so you needed to fire off a lot of them to do any real damage. Once someone discovered that carving grooves into the barrel made the weapon more accurate, the musket was replaced by the rifle." Skylar nodded. "So, what was the rifle that you used at first?" "That was a Lee Enfield Mark III. It's a design that dates over 100 years back to the Great War." Skylar raised an eyebrow. "How can a war be great?" Neil shrugged. "Don't know who called it that, but it is likewise known as World War I. Other nicknames called it the Great Adventure or the War to End All Wars. Basically, it was several armies across the entire world fighting each other. It was the first modern war that was fought across the world on multiple fronts. The most commonly known is the European front, where English and French and later American troops battled German troops. There was also the Asian front, the Arabian front, the Russian front, the Austrian front, and the African front." Skylar gave a low whistle. "And you said it was World War I? There was another?" Neil nodded. "Yeah, the war to end all war didn't do as advertised. National interests and punishing the defeated came before restoring the world. Old rivalries and grudges played a part in creating a treaty that was anything but fair and outright embarrassing. 2 decades later, a soldier who had fought in the war got into politics and made the entire nation fall to madness. He was stopped, of course, but not before the world paid a heavy price, somewhere near 15 million lives lost, 6 million of those ordered by the madman himself." Skylar shuddered. Neil nodded and then thought back to the Lee Enfield, but then felt the book glow again. He pulled it out and read what it wrote. "Always keep your creations close by. As a forger's talents and creations are always in high demand, you never know when they may decide to sprout legs and walk off. Forging requires mana and your reserves are low. A good night's rest will replenish it, but for now, try recycling the weapon you summoned for a demonstration. Once that's done, try your request again." Neil focused on the musket, making it fade away, and then thought back on the forge and then decided for something else. This time he thought of a semi-auto rifle like the M1 Garand, but sadly he was missing a component, so he tried the next best thing. He opened his eyes to see an American Springfield 1903 rifle. He then changed the .303 rounds to .30-06 and nodded to Skylar. "All right, I'm set." "So, where to?" Skylar pointed east across the meadow. "Home.
88888888888 asterisk underscore 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 asterisk dash 8888888 underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk dash 8888888. The sun had set by the time they reached the village. As they approached the gate, a cheetah on guard started yelling. "He's alive! Skylar's alive! Open the gate!" Almost at once the gate opened, revealing 7 armed cheetahs who looked to Skylar with relieved glances, but then snarled and readied their weapons as they saw Neil. One of them glanced to Skylar. "Skylar, what is the meaning of this? Bringing an outsider to our gate?" Skylar raised his hands. "It's all right. He's the hero who saved me. I would not be alive right now if not for this person's heroics. Please, he seeks an audience with Chief Prowless to contact Warfang. He'll only be staying long enough to rest from his journey, buy some supplies for the trip, and be off in the morning." One of the cheetahs growled. "Why should we aid him?" There was a cough from behind that made them turn to see a cheetah in a red cloak come up behind them. They all stood aside and nodded to the cheetah, immediately giving Neil the notion that this was an important member of the village. Skylar smiled and closed with the cheetah and gripped his hand in a firm grip. "Hunter, I'm glad to see you're here and not in Warfang at the moment. This man, he needs to go to Warfang. He's not from here and now, in rescuing me, has made himself a target of Shadra's minions. Plus, he has some unique abilities they may want to see." Hunter looked to Neil and then looked to his weapons. "His weapons, armor, and clothing is odd, that's for sure. So then, what is this ability you speak of?" Skylar smiled. "I believe he is what the legends call an Atoker, one who creates something from pure mana." Neil suddenly felt every single pair of eyes assembled on him. He glanced to Skylar. I don't know what an Atoker is, but I'm pretty sure I'm not one." Skylar shook his head. "No, Neil, a Torker is our word for a forger, someone who creates great works either for peace or war. The moles, Atloa, Manwiersmals, and even a few other races, including the apes, have other names for one of your talents." Neil sighed and glanced to him and then noticed the excited looks of the cheetahs gathering around him. "Why do I have a feeling I'm about to become very popular in this world?" The ape leader growled as he rubbed his shoulder where the bayonet had been removed and the wound bound up. He now stood before Shadra, a dragoness who, while she was the same size as Cinder had been when she was corrupted, she was undeniably an adult and was of a completely different scale color. Hers were flame red with orange undertones, her underbelly was charcoal black with spots of red here and there like glowing embers, her horns were ivory white and curved back elegantly. Her body shape was undeniably female and her tail blade was shaped like a cross between an arming sword and an épée. Most striking though were her eyes, flame red with a hint of the corrupting darkness underlying them, manifesting as a small swirling violet cloud that seemingly glowed when she was excited or angry. She gazed at the weapon another ape had brought before her and now gazed at the bayonet that lay beside it. Chuckling, she smiled, revealing all her teeth, a sight which unnerved the leader greatly. "So, a forger has returned." Just as quickly as Neil had been shown hostility from the cheetahs, as soon as Skylar had called him an Atorker, they immediately showed him to a hut reserved for visiting travelers and traders. As he sat there on a carved wooden chair, he opened the Book of Forging, which is what he had taken to calling it, and scrolled through its pages looking for some ideas. Strangely, there was a section of the book within the book that was bound with only a note written on it. "Not to be opened until you can better control your abilities, and don't try to sneak a peek, I'll know." Neil chuckled. "Sounds like something my high school girlfriend once said." Neil suddenly thought of something and looked to the book. "Hey, what about reference materials? Could I summon other books that I had read before and go over them?" The book glowed for a moment,
then flipped to a blank page and the word reference section appeared. A small note was then scribbled underneath. While a book technically cannot be forged, it can be manifested and remembered. I am merely to aid you in deciding what would suit the situation. Like a wizard's spellbook, I will store the mechanical and elemental composition of anything you forge. If you wish for reference materials, just remember what books you want and I'll diagram them from your memory. That's how all forgers did so in the past. Neil nodded and then thought of something. Just how old are you? Another footnote. Old enough to know that you should never ask any self-respecting enchanted book their age. Neil nodded and then closed his eyes. Before he knew it, he was asleep, dreaming, yet at the same time, he kept seeing several books appear before him, open, and flip through their pages before vanishing when completed. When he was in high school, he had been a student of history as well as a bit of both a nerd and an athlete. He kept his nose in the books and kept his body at peak condition. His best subject was actually the late 1890s and early 1900s. His report on the cause and effect of World War I had actually earned the respect of his teacher, who had forwarded the report to a state archive who, once they had read it, were floored by the way it was written. No sooner had the last book closed and vanished than did he slip into a sound sleep. It seemed almost a moment later that a loud noise broke him from his slumber, and he shot awake to find himself still sitting at the desk with the book still sitting open, the transparent quill busy writing, drawing, and diagramming everything he had seen in his dream. He turned to see the source of the noise and saw a young cheetah with a plate of food that she had dropped, staring open-mouthed at the book. Neil gazed at her and nodded. "Good morning." This got the girl's attention and she nodded but kept her eyes on the book. "Does it always do that while you sleep?" Neil watched the book for a moment and shook his head. "No, but I had a busy night. Trying to recall every piece of mechanical knowledge I ever learned so the book could transcribe it. Apparently all to make me a better forger, or in your people's case, an atorker." This made the girl visibly relax and Neil nodded that it was all right to watch. As he glanced at the book, the diagram it was drawing was suddenly clear to him and he smiled. "I'd forgotten about that book." The girl turned to him. "What book?" Neil pointed to the diagram. "Early aircraft of the Second World War. You see, in a period of time where flight was being discovered and built upon, some nations still used biplanes while others were quickly building monoplanes. This diagram is blueprint of a British gladiator which saw action in 1940 at the Siege of Malta, holding off wave after wave of Italian CR-32s and NCR-42s until help could arrive." The girl nodded at the drawing but then remembered and gazed back to the spilled tray. "I'm sorry, I was bringing you breakfast, but I was so startled by the book that I—" Neil nodded. "It's all right. Is there anywhere else I can get something?" The girl nodded. "Yes, the cooking hut is always open in case of our hunters. I believe that Hunter and Skylar are there now preparing to go off on a hunt." Neil nodded. "Perfect. That'll give me a chance to talk to them and, if they'll let me, I'll go hunting with them." The girl nodded. "All right, you can leave your gear here. Orders from Hunter that no one is to disturb you or your belongings. Not that any cheetah would. We despise thieves." Neil nodded. "Good to know. All right, lead on." As Neil stepped outside, he was aware that, despite being called a village, the cheetah settlement was more like a small town. The outside wall was large and stone-looking, there were dirt trails but houses aplenty, even a few longhouses were visible. In the rear of the town was a larger house, likely Chief Prowlis' residence, then there was a windmill, and a watermill, and even more houses. The long building they were walking towards, Neil guessed, was the cooking hut. Besides that was what looked to be a trade store, and a smithy beside that. There were also several large gardens on the other side that grew many different types of vegetables and some fruit trees in the back. All the makings of a medieval town, These cheetahs are doing far better than some human towns of that age, that's for sure. Then he saw something interesting, a small hut with blue smoke rising from the top. The girl saw his glance and nodded. That's Mistra's tent. She's an enchanter. She also does magic for the younger ones while their parents are off hunting or gathering things. Neil nodded and refrained from the D&D reference. Then he looked to her. If I created something, do you think she would enchant it for me? The girl shrugged and a voice came from behind. Depends. What sort of enchantment would you like? Neil jumped and turned to see a young cheetah clad in violet robes behind him, smiling gently to the girl before redirecting her gaze to him. Neil quickly recovered his train of thought and nodded. Something to tell me how much mana I have left. I know that every time I forge something it takes a bit of mana, depending on how complex it is. I'd just like a little reminder as to how much mana I have left. Mistra smiled and nodded. A sensible thing for one who practices a lost art. Mana is important for all beings who study and use magic. Neil nodded and looked towards the cook hut. I'm just on my way to breakfast. Mistra nodded. As am I. Create what you'd like to enchant there, and I'll have it ready for you by the end of the day. Neil nodded, and together the three of them entered the cook hut. As soon as Neil entered, he spotted Skylar and Hunter, who waved him over. He was amazed at what was before him. Biscuits, ham, bacon, eggs, chicken, milk and juice. All of it on a mammoth scale, as if the table was meant to serve several dozen people at once. When Neil posed the question to Skylar, he nodded. Indeed, we're the early risers and the first to arrive. In order to get the best choices we have to. No, hunting is not a one-cheetah job. It consists of teams going into the plains to bag whatever they can and then bring it back to be cooked, smoked, salted, and preserved. Neil nodded and then motioned for Mistra and the girl to take a seat before he did, which earned a nod from Skylar and Hunter. Neil chuckled at their nods. I was raised to always offer a seat to a lady before seating myself. Mistra nodded. Sounds like wherever you're from you were raised right. Neil nodded. Yep. Anyway, before I create something, let's get a bite because, quite frankly, I haven't eaten anything since the day before yesterday. The breakfast was silent and casual, with a few small conversations between Skylar, Hunter, and whoever else was arriving at the moment. Soon the table was full of cheetahs who were eating, smiling, talking to one another, swapping stories, even joking with one another. It made Neil think of how his brother always acted, and he wiped a tear from his eye. Mistra noticed this and spoke. What's wrong? Neil shook his head. Nothing, it's just. I remembered all the times like this when I was young with my family growing up. My older brother always joking at the table, getting the rest of us to laugh. He sighed. Skylar nodded. My sympathies for your loss. How did it happen? Neil nodded and smiled. Like me, my brother was in the service, the military. Different branch though. I was a guardsman, he was a Marine. Skylar nodded. What's the difference? In the Guard you work to protect the homeland in times of war and patrol in peace, ever watchful, ever vigilant. In the Marines you go where the fighting is, and you do whatever you can to make the enemy regret picking a fight with your nation. The training is brutal, but the results are undisputable. I don't play favorites with the branches, but the Marines are some of the best trained soldiers in the world, my world at least. In my honest opinion, only the SEALs rank higher, but that's only because they do the jobs that they'll never get credit for. He paused to take a drink of milk from the cup before him and continued. It is said that if every mission a Navy SEAL has accomplished ever came to light, every single member of the teams would be awarded the Medal of Honor for their bravery. But they aren't, because if such things did come to light it would be dangerous for them and their families. Anyway, my brother, he was a pilot, like me. Only I flew rescue choppers and he flew aircraft, jets. Neil sighed.
One day I was just speaking to him, asking his opinion of what branch of service I should join, and the next, 2 Marines show up to our house, dressed blues, regretting to inform us that my brother had apparently been shot down and killed while providing air support to a pinned-down group of UN peacekeepers. He died so that they could live. Skylar nodded. A noble sacrifice. Still, you would trade it all for one more day with him, right? Neil nodded. Hunter then smiled. You know what? I'm eager to see that rifle of yours in action. How about you? Skylar and I form a hunting team, and when we return, you rest and we can set out tomorrow for Warfang. Neil nodded. Sounds like a plan to me. But first, Neil closed his eyes and then ran through all sorts of ideas for a mana device. Finally, he settled on an aviator's chronograph, only this one had a wider face and was divided into 3 sections, green, yellow, and red. The clock hands worked as they should but had an underlying hand that would move as his mana depleted. When he pieced it together and opened his eyes, everyone at the table was silent in awe, as where his hand had been was now a watch, roughly the same size as a $50 piece, with a leather band and clad in silver. He then nodded that it was correct and passed the device to Mistra, who nodded. An impressive display. I can even see how practical such a device would be. I'll get this enchanted and, like I said earlier, it should be ready by the time you return. Neil nodded his thanks and turned to Hunter. So, when do we set out? Hunter smiled. As soon as we're ready. Neil nodded and then thought of something. If you'll excuse me, I'll go get my equipment ready. Hunter and Skylar nodded as Neil rose and left for his hut. Once he was back inside, he saw that the book had finished transcribing everything in his mind and a little note to the side that made him chuckle. Ever get your nose out of a book? Not when I was interested in its contents. Now that you've got all of them transcribed, it makes you just as interesting. The quill appeared and wrote another footnote. Flatterer. Neil chuckled before settling down and turning the book to the Class 0 summons, and then started thinking of a camo suitable for the meadow. He then remembered seeing his brother dressed up in a ghillie suit he had bought years ago and then decided to go with that. A soft warmth answered him and he turned to see a sniper's ghillie suit laying on the bed. Neil changed out of the trench coat and the clothes from yesterday and donned the new ones he had also summoned, placed the armor over the clothes, and then worked the ghillie suit over the armor before turning to the rifle and looking the M1903 Springfield over before nodding to himself and strapping the rifle and ammo along with his M1911. Just as he rose, though, he had a thought and looked to the book. Since you now have everything I've ever read in there, did I ever read anything on suppressors for rifles and pistols? The book glowed once and flipped to a page in the weapons section, and he saw the diagram of a suppressor and nodded. Hunter and Skylar use bows which are silent. The least I can do is try and silence the weapon so that I don't scare away all the animals. He managed to modify the rifle and pistol, giving them barrels that could accommodate a suppressor, and then forged 2 of them and attached them to the weapons. Satisfied with his work, he rose, rest-wrapped the weapons to his suit, and headed out the door. As he approached the gate he saw Hunter, Skylar, and several other cheetahs waiting. They caught a glimpse of Neil and chuckled openly, which Neil shared. Skylar looked to him. What is that? You look like a pile of walking grass. Neil nodded. That's the point. I figured if I was going hunting, the least I could do was camouflage myself so that I'm harder to see, and also fixed my weapons so that the noise won't scare away the animals we're hunting. Skylar nodded. Indeed. The deer we hunt are skittish at best and will likely take off at the sound of thunder that rifle makes. So, how did you fix it? Neil unslung the rifle and tapped the suppressor. This is a suppressor. They're used to quiet weapons that generate too much noise when fired. For example, the rifle sounds like a thunderclap when fired, but then the suppressor is attached, it sounds more like a book falling into a hay bale. Skylar looked at the weapon and nodded. Impressive.
To be honest, the reason you're going with both me and Hunter is so that in the event you scare the deer off we can pick up the slack and still bring in our usual numbers. Neil chuckled. Understood, but fair warning, I'm an expert marksman with the rifle, suppressor, or no. Hunter looked at the weapon and thought of something. How far can a rifle like that shoot? It can't be more than a few hundred yards at best. Neil chuckled. Actually, this particular rifle is rated for at least 2,000 yards. Hunter looked skeptical but nodded. However, a cheetah Neil didn't know growled and pointed to him. All right then, prove it. We have a little time before we start the hunt. Go to the practice range and we'll see how good you are. Neil looked to Hunter, who nodded, and the group started for the range. 888888888888 underscore asterisk 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 underscore 888888 dash asterisk underscore 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 8-8-8-8-8-8-8. The archery range was bigger than Neil expected it to be. There was enough room for 20 archers to take place and shoot at several targets ranging anywhere from 100 yards to an optimistic 1,000 yards. The cheetah who had challenged him, whose name Skylar told him was Lark, stood at a post, drew an arrow effortlessly and loosed, striking the bullseye of the 500-yard target. Neil opened the bolt of the rifle, pulled the 5-round stripper clip from his pack, loaded it, closed the bolt and aimed down the iron sights at the 500-yard target. However, Hunter set a hand on the rifle to stop him. One does not set their sights on the farthest target first. First, you must show that you can hit the target at close range as well. Aim for the closest target first, and then work your way down range. Neil nodded, shifted his aim to the 100-yard target, and fired. He was rewarded by seeing Skylar remove his hands from his ears in disbelief as the suppressor actually did as Neil had said it would. The report was just like someone dropping a book into a bale of hay. The round struck the red fabric covering the bullseye. Neil looked at Lark, who nodded. Good, at least you can hit close-range targets. Now try the next one. I warn you though, 250 is the best that most hunters can achieve. Only experts like myself, Skylar, and Hunter can hit the 500 mark. The next target was 250 yards. Neil worked the action, removing the spent round and loading another and aiming down range. He squeezed the trigger and the weapon fired. Once again, the round was accurate and struck the bullseye. The cheetahs nearby whistled low in amazement. Lark nodded. Good. You pass for a hunter, now let's see if you can really do as good as say you can. Aim at the 500. Neil chambered the next round, aimed at the target, and fired. The only indication that he had hit the target was that Lark's arrow suddenly splintered as the round struck it and nailed the bullseye. As the ruined arrow fell to the ground, Lark's jaw went slack and he turned to Neil. Nor was he the only one. Hunter and Skylar and all the other hunters gathered were in awe. Neil turned to Hunter and pointed to the farthest target. If it's not presumptuous of me, would you mind if I took a shot at the 1,000-yard target? Hunter recovered, smiled, and nodded. Neil gave a nod to him and then to Lark and chambered the next round, aimed at the farthest target, and fired. The round struck the red fabric covering the bullseye once more. Neil nodded and lowered the weapon and looked to Hunter, who was scratching his chin thoughtfully. At the same time, Skylar looked on in disbelief, as did all the other archers. Lark gazed at the target in the distance and then looked back to Neil and chuckled. Well then, I guess that answers my question. All right then. Neil, was it? You won this challenge. I still have another though, one that all new hunter have to pass. You're going with Hunter and Skylar, well then, a hunter's challenge. You must claim at least 5 kills before the day is done. But be warned, nothing small like rabbits. No, you must kill 5 deer or anything else that Hunter okays. Do you accept? Neil turned to Hunter. Is this traditional? Hunter nodded. You are an outsider who has been granted shelter here. If you wish to join the hunt, it is expected that you pull your weight. Neil nodded. Very well then. I accept your challenge. Neil carefully crept through the tall grass of the plains, mimicking Hunter and Skylar's every move. He managed to catch sight of the prey they were tracking, a large herd of deer that seemed to have no inkling that they were being stalked. Through his scope as they had approached, he had seen the group comprised of roughly 7 bucks, male deer, over 20 does, female deer, and all but 6 of them had yearlings, baby deer, with them. The leader of the herd was, as Hunter had pointed out, the largest of the male deer. The particular one that Neil believed the leader was a deer the size of which that, if this animal had been in Texas, he'd have had every hunter in the state trying to bag him. The dominant male was large, 7 feet tall at the shoulders, well-muscled, and his antler rack was the largest Neil had ever seen. There was a deer joke about a 30-point buck. Well, this one may not have been 30 points, but he was close enough. The spread of the antlers was enough that if the deer could have wrapped his antlers around a tree trunk with no trouble. He pointed the leader out to Hunter, who nodded and then pointed to the others. That male deer, he's about the right size we want. If you can take him down, he's your first kill. Be aware though that with a group this small, we rarely kill more than 3 animals and never harm the babies. You've got your target. Skylar and I are going for 2 of the does with no little ones. Once we loose our arrows, you take your shot. Neil nodded and slowly raised the rifle to his eye. To him, using iron sights on a rifle was nothing. He was an expert marksman with the rifle, as attested by the 17 trophies he won in high school and in the USCG for best marksmanship. It was no trouble for him to take aim at the lead buck and give the go-ahead to Skylar and Hunter. The moment their arrows left their bows, the deer perked up their ears, likely hearing the sound the bowstring makes when it springs back into place after release. He lowered the aim on the deer and squeezed the trigger. The suppressor worked like a charm and the round sped on and struck home right through the chest cavity behind the shoulder of the deer. No sooner did the male deer drop dead than the arrows from the bows come flying in, striking the 2 female deer. Hunter's went down cleanly, but Skylar's bucked and started crying as it tried to get away. By this time, the rest of the herd was bounding away and Skylar had risen from the grass, used his incredible speed to close with the wounded doe and, using his hunting knife, quickly put the creature out of its misery. He took a deep breath and gazed at the deer Neil had dropped and nodded appreciatively. That's one in lark's eye for him. You just bagged Granda. Neil looked to him. Granda? Skylar nodded. A big deer we've seen around here for years, but no one's ever been able to draw a bead on him. Lark has tried, and failed, more times than I can count. He's going to have to eat his words when you show up bringing that behemoth back to the village. Neil smiled at the accomplishment and then looked back to Hunter. Well, that's 1 kill down. I still have 4 to go, right? Hunter nodded. Indeed. And Skylar and I still have 8 to go. The day is still young, though. We'll drag these back to our camp and then head out in another direction. The scent of blood in the area will keep the deer away from here for a time until the rains come again and wash the scent away. Neil looked at Hunter curiously. How often does it rain here? Hunter looked to him. Oh, if I had to guess, I'd say twice a week on average. Avalar is pretty close to the forest and the sea, so we get plenty of storms blowing through. Tell me something, do you have any storms in your world? Neil nodded. Oh yeah. Texas borders a huge body of water called the Gulf of Mexico. Around the late part of the year, we start getting what we call tropical depressions that, if conditions are right, can turn into superstorms called hurricanes. Hunter nodded. Are they extremely dangerous? Neil nodded. Yeah, there was one a few years back. I was in school when it made landfall, but Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 when she hit. Damn near drowned the city of New Orleans in Louisiana and cut power to half the state. Then almost right on her heels came Hurricane Rita. Another worse one that was more recent was Hurricane Sandy. She took an early curve, went all the way up the eastern coast of the United States, laying waste to seaside communities in several states from Florida to New York. Hunter nodded. Nature is a truly terrifying thing at times. Neil gave him a wan smile and nodded again. That's true. Mankind's biggest folly is that we believe that we can predict what nature will do when in fact we don't know what it'll do. The best we can do is give an estimated guess as to what will happen next. Mankind plans, the world laughs, as they say. Hunter chuckled. Now that's one I haven't heard before. Neil nodded and went to the deer he had downed and shook his head. If only my brother could see me now. He glanced at Skylar and Hunter, who were busy tying ropes around the forelegs of their deer, and then he did the same, double wrapping the rope around the front legs of the buck and then tying a double knot in the rope. As soon as he slung the rope over his shoulder and started pulling, soon he was joined by both the cheetahs, who were likewise pulling their kills along the fated trail through the grass back to the camp. It was a good 30 minutes back to the camp. It was a large setup suited for numerous hunting groups to come and go. At the moment there were 2 other groups here, including Lark, who, once he saw Neil with his catch, sprang up in surprise. You blasted, that's Granda. That was supposed to be my catch. Neil shrugged. Well, I didn't see your name on him. This made Hunter and Skylar and several other cheetahs burst out laughing. Lark glowered, but after a while recovered his good nature and joined in on the laugh. Well, it was an obsession that I needed to see ended anyway. Makes things more interesting to see what male will be the alpha next season. Neil nodded and then relaxed for a moment before glancing towards a distant hill. After a while, he looked over to the cheetahs and saw the hunters at rest flipping pieces of thin, carved wood around, and on each was carved a crest, what looked to be a number, and a symbol. Neil, after gazing at them for a while, realized what they were doing. He smiled and walked over to them. Playing cards? Lark looked to him and cocked his head to one side. I beg your pardon? Neil knelt down and examined the pieces of wood and then gazed at Lark. In my world, we have thin pieces of paper called cards. These pieces of wood look almost like those cards. Lark gave a slight nod and then showed Neil the wood pieces. All right then, these pieces of wood are called habertiles. A woodcarver takes 52 pieces of thinly cut wood, sands them smooth, and then etches several designs on the back and then labels the face. How are these cards of yours made? Neil nodded. A factory produces paper from wood pulp. An artist then creates the back design, then divides the cards into 4 stacks or suites. Each suite is given a number from 2 to 10, 3 face cards, the jack, the queen, and the king, and then lastly the ace. Lark glanced to the tiles and nodded. It is the same with the tiles. Only our face cards are the hunter, the shaman, and the chieftain. Neil nodded and took a moment to fish around his backpack and found the small deck of cards he had created earlier while the book was transcribing. He then looked to Lark and nodded. This is a deck of cards. With it, I can play everything from solitaire to poker, go fish, and blackjack. You know, some people actually believe that you could read one's future by drawing cards at random. Lark nodded. Indeed. It is the same with the tiles in the village. Do you know how to do this? Neil nodded. Not really, but I've heard a few of the predictions. Neil first shuffled the cards, split the deck, folded them onto one another, and then patted the deck back into uniformity. Okay. First card is the 10 of clubs. Next we have the ace of spades. Then we have the king of diamonds. After that is the jack of hearts. Now, the last card is what ties it together, and we have the Queen of Diamonds. Neil smiled and glanced at Lark, but then his expression turned to one of shock and he gazed at the cards. Holy smokes, I drew a straight. Where the hell was this kind of luck when I went to Vegas that one time? Lark started laughing at Neil's shock, as did Hunter, Skylar, and the others. Neil, after recovering from the shock, fell into laughing with them, and then he gazed over to the hill again. What he saw made him gape in amazement. Hunter, Skylar, Lark, look at that. The hunters all turned to see what Neil was pointing at, and they too went slack-jawed in amazement. There, 3 hills opposite of them, was a large group of some sort of large boar. Hunter looked to Neil and then back to the others. Well, hardly a hunt, but we take what we can get. I'll admit, though, it's unusual to see wild boar coming this close to the camp. They've never done so before. Neil nodded and then unslung his rifle. Perhaps they're either curious or they haven't caught our scent yet. Well then, shall we? Hunter nodded with a smirk and motioned for Skylar. Let's start running them. If we can get them spooked and scatter them, we'll be able to pick them off from the hill. He turned back to Neil. These wild boar are a real problem. They will sometimes chase off deer herds, root up gardens, and even attack our scouts. They're probably the only animal that we hunt that we have the okay from the chief to wipe out any group we find. Less of a headache for us and for the healers and the gardeners. Neil nodded. Okay, so how do we go about this? Hunter nodded. We usually have runners who sprint around the boars. The males will charge to protect their females and young, while the females will run with the little ones and try to escape. While the runners keep the males busy, archers start shooting volley after volley into the rest of the group. Afterwards, they turn and put down the males, and we simply take them, truss them all up, and cart them all back to the village. Lark then smiled and glanced at Neil. By the way, boar do count to your total. So if you have a target, drop it. Neil nodded and then looked to Hunter and Skylar. So you said the 2 of you will be the runners? Hunter nodded. We'll run them, the rest of you shoot. Neil opened the rifle bolt halfway to check and make sure there was a round in the chamber, closed it back and nodded to him. I'll do my part. You two just make sure you don't get gored. I've seen what boars like these can do when they're riled or cornered, and it ain't pretty. Just in case though, I'm going to take the suppressor off the rifle and fix the bayonet, so this is going to be loud. Skylar nodded. We'll be careful. Now then, hunters to your posts. Hunter, let's go. In a flash, the 2 cheetahs were off running across the field. Neil gazed to Lark and saw him readying himself by sticking several arrows into the ground and readying one on the bow. He gazed down to his belt, drew the incredible 14-inch long dagger from its sheath, and, once he removed the suppressor, fitted the dagger to the lug under the muzzle of the barrel. When it snapped into place, he noticed several of the cheetahs looking at him curiously. Before they could ask a question, though, several yells and squeals got their attention, and the group gazed to see several boars running back over the hill. A group of 8 male boars were all but falling over themselves pursuing Hunter and Skylar while, true to what Hunter had said, the female boars and the little ones were trying to sneak away from the threat, unaware of the trap they were running into. Lark nodded to the others, and the cheetahs drew their bows back, steadied themselves, and released the first volley of arrows. Having grown up helping his grandfather tend the farm he owned during the summer months whenever he wasn't crisscrossing the country with his father on his collection trades and gun shows, Neil knew how loudly boars and pigs could squeal. However, compared to the squeal these boar let out, that made the tame pigs he worked with growing up seem several decibels quieter. After recovering from the shock of the audible barrage, Neil leveled the rifle, aimed over one of the females, and squeezed the trigger. He felt Lark's eyes on him as the weapon fired, unsuppressed, for the first time. The crack of thunder momentarily splitting the air and drowning out the squealing.
Quickly, he lifted the bolt, slid it back ejecting the spent round, closed it back and then aimed again over another target and fired again. It became a RYTHMN, fire, cycle bolt, close, fire, repeat. He did this twice more and with the last one, he glanced and saw he was out of bullets. He placed the butt of the rifle on his knee, pulled another 5-round stripper clip from his belt, fitted it to the breech, pushed the 5 rounds down into the magazine, and then closed the bolt. He managed to fire 3 rounds before the last of the sows dropped. Then he turned back to where Skylar and Hunter had been and was immediately concerned. The male boars, hearing the squealing of the females, started ignoring the 2 cheetahs running around them and coming towards the hunters at the camp. Upon seeing what was before them, they must have gone completely berserk. Neil turned to Lark, face grave. Male boars incoming. Neil glanced at the archers' quivers, and to his horror he realized that only 2 of the 8 archers still had arrows in their quivers. Between Lark and the other hunter they had 5 arrows remaining. The other hunters drew long swords and other long daggers. Neil then did something he thought he'd never do. When he was young, he'd heard about how British soldiers in the First World War could do what was known as the Mad Minute, 30 rounds, aimed, in 60 seconds. Of course, the Lee Enfield rifles they used had 10 rounds, twice that of the American Springfield, but still, he had to do something as there was no way in his mind anyone would escape this encounter without injury. He placed his middle finger on the trigger, gripped the bolt with his thumb and forefinger, and commenced fire. The first 2 rounds dropped 2 of the male boars. He reloaded another 5-round clip with ease, slammed the bolt closed, and resumed firing. He was unaware that slowly, almost incredulously, every cheetah in the camp was watching him repeat the smooth actions. By the time the last round was fired and the 7th boar was down, there was one left, the largest of the group, and it was seeing red. Neil, adrenaline flowing, his heart pounding, gave a battle cry, leveled the bayonet at the boar, and charged. In his mind, he vaguely registered that he must have looked like a World War I soldier charging across no man's land. All that was missing was the explosions of artillery rounds and the sounds of bullets whizzing by his head. As they closed, the boar lowered his head, ready to put the foot-long sharp tusks to use. Neil, having practiced with a bayonet rifle before, swung the bayonet around, slapped the solid steel dagger against the boar's head, and then pushed. The bayonet slid cleanly into the torso as the momentum carried the beast all the way to the muzzle and even onto the barrel. Yet the injury, somehow, wasn't fatal. The boar started thrashing, managing to wrench the rifle from Neil's hands, and thrashed around trying to get the weapon out of its body. It also started squealing as pain managed to fight through the rage and reach the boar's brain. Neil quickly, effortlessly, drew the knuckle duster from his belt, jumped onto the back of the boar, and finished the creature off quickly. The alpha boar slowed, stopped, and then dropped to the ground and was still. Exhausted by the adrenaline leaving and his heart still fluttering, he rolled off the boar, panting and shaking but also laughing to himself. A moment of rest and Neil was pulling himself up, gazing at the rifle still stuck in the boar and then to the approaching hunters as well as both Hunter and Skylar who were absolutely in shock. Neil fought to calm his breathing and smiled and then glanced back at the boar. Now I really wish I had a camera. Lark looked to him curiously and then noted the boar and whistled. That beast is bigger than we thought. Well, Neil, I'll admit it. You've impressed me several times over. Neil nodded his thanks to him and then turned to Hunter. Well, think we've got enough? Hunter chuckled at that, nodded, and turned to the others. Looks like our hunting is complete today. Let's get our kills in the wagon and get them back to the village. The cheetahs cheered at that and they went about the work of removing their arrows from their kills, counting them, and then loading them up on the large wagon they brought with them. As Neil removed the rifle from the boar he had speared with it, Hunter came up and patted his shoulder. You've actually done it. To be honest, we've rarely claimed this many kills. You have managed to complete Lark's challenge and more.
It would be an honor to escort you to Warfang. To be honest, I've been testing you. I needed to see what kind of person you are. The fact that you are an Atorker adds to it, but that just tells me about your abilities, not the person wielding them. Neil nodded. I half expected as much. Given the circumstances, I can understand. If you'd like to know anything, I'd be glad to tell you everything about my world if you'd like. Hunter nodded. I would indeed. Is it true what you told my niece? That your race has learned how to fly? Neil immediately remembered the young girl who had brought him breakfast that morning and nodded. Indeed. It's funny, really. These days, well, in my world flying is an everyday occurrence. People cross entire continents, oceans, nations in the span of hours on journeys that once took months or years to complete. Yet, for all the advancement, we only really discovered flight about 100 years ago. Hunter nodded, clearly interested. If you want to hear where it began, it all starts with the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, and their historic flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903. It lasted only a few seconds, but that short hop proved that flight was possible. For the first years, flying was a rare privilege for the wealthy and the military. It wasn't until after the First World War that flying became open to the masses. Hunter stopped him there. I've heard of that as well. What is this First World War? Neil took a breath to explain, but he was stopped by Skylar running for them. Hunter. Spyro and Cinder are incoming. As Hunter nodded and then gazed around, he suddenly froze and growled. Apes? On the far meadow and closing fast. Neil turned, saw the incoming creatures, and frowned. Bloody hell. Neil absently reached into his belt and inwardly cursed that he only had 3 5-round stripper clips left for the rifle and had 3 clips for the M1911. He gazed to Hunter, who was also looking around to the other cheetahs who were busy pulling any salvageable arrows out of their kills for reuse. How many are there? Hunter sighed. Too many. We cannot outrun them, but we also cannot abandon our kills. The village would be hard-pressed for food, and that is something we cannot allow. I thought the apes would leave us alone now that the war is over, but that damned Dragoness Shadra has stirred them up again. He then looked to Neil. Since Skylar and I still have arrows left over and Spyro and Cinder are almost here, we may be able to buy the others more time to escape. Unlike Skylar and myself, Lark and the others are hunters, not soldiers. I need to know, what will you do, Neil? You don't need to stay here, but at the same time I would be grateful if you were. Neil nodded. When the chronicler sent me here, he told me to find Spyro and Cinder, that they would be able to keep me out of Shadra's claws. As a forger, or a torker, she believes I can create a device capable of freeing Malfor. Hunter paled and gazed at him. If that dragon were free again, I fear our world wouldn't be as lucky as it was the first time. Neil looked away and then to the ape force approaching them. He held his rifle and then sighed. If this Malfor was as evil as Hunter was saying, then why should he risk putting all of them in danger? He knew he wouldn't retreat, but at the same time he couldn't allow himself to be captured either. He realized what he was thinking and turned to Hunter. Hunter, I'm going to need a promise from you and Skylar. Hunter nodded that he was listening. If it looks like I am in danger of being captured, Neil suddenly heard a horn blast and saw the apes getting in formation to attack, and then heard wing beats and saw 2 dragons, smaller than Ignitus, but almost as tall as Hunter and he, land nearby and run towards Hunter. The purple dragon spoke first. Hunter, are we glad to see you? We almost thought we were too late. Hunter nodded. No, my friends, you are just in time. Spyro, have your Abelites returned yet? The purple dragon, Spyro, shook his head. Nothing yet, and it's been almost 2 years. I'm starting to worry if I'll ever get them back. Then the black and red female laid a wing over Spyro's back and rubbed her head against his. It's all right, Spyro. I'm sure they'll return someday soon. For now, though, let's just focus on the here and now. Spyro nodded, a slight blush on his face. You're right, Cinder. I just wish I didn't feel so helpless all the time. A sudden golden blur came from around them and hovered close to Spyro. Well, if you ask me, buddy, you're still a lot stronger and far more frightening than I am. I mean, seriously, what can a dragonfly like me do when compared to an actual dragon almost, 200 times my size? The dragonfly flew over to Hunter and then saw Neil. He stopped for a moment, then screamed loudly and flew behind Spyro's horns. Spyro! Look! A hairless APE. Spyro then noticed Neil and went into a defensive posture. Cinder, however, went wide-eyed and the scales around her face flushed in shock. Sparks, that's no ape, that's a human. Sparks then rose up and sighed with relief. Oh, okay, I guess that's something else. Say, Cinder, why are you shaking? Spyro looked to Cinder and then back to Neil. What's wrong with a human? Cinder looked to him. You never heard stories about them growing up, did you? They were supposed to be myth, creatures that killed dragons. Spyro then went wide-eyed and looked to Neil and growled. Hunter, however, stepped in front of him. Spyro, Cinder, easy, it's all right. He's been helping us. At that moment, Skylar showed up. Yes, indeed. He saved my life from some apes who had cornered me. He's an Atorker, I suppose dragons know them as forgers. Needless to say, they got Cinder's attention. A human a forger? That's impossible. Wait, no. It couldn't be. Spyro looked to her curiously. Cinder? What's wrong? Cinder sighed and lowered her head. When I was Malefor's slave, he used Shadra, the other dragoness like me, to hunt for a type of magic that had been sealed away for many years. It was always said the ancestors had sent the magic to another world, another plane, or dimension. If this human is a forger. Neil nodded. I am indeed. The chronicler, a dragon named Ignitus Spyro, gave him a sharp glare. What did you just say? Neil gulped. The chronicler, he said his name was Ignitus, that he was the chronicler for the new age. Neil stopped as Spyro visibly sagged and Cinder lay a wing over him and smiled. Spyro returned the smile, but his voice faltered. He survived, and he's the chronicler. I am sorry. Ignitus, he was my teacher, almost like a father to me. I thought I'd lost him when we crossed the belt of fire. Neil nodded his understanding and then continued. He told me to seek the two of you out. That you would be able to protect me until I had mastered my abilities. I know that Shadra seeks me because she wants me to create something to free Malefor, but given what I've learned, I'd rather him remain in whatever prison he's in. I don't want to harm an innocent. I was a pararescueman, someone sworn to save lives, to grab someone from the verge of death and not let them go until help arrived. Cinder visibly relaxed and her gaze softened. So you're really not the monster our myths tell of you? Neil shook his head. I'm not. But to be fair, our race has myths about dragons as well. However, there are both good and bad dragons in our stories. Most stories involving a human killing a dragon involved the dragon committing unspeakable crimes and killing the innocent. Neil saw Cinder gulp and Spyro glance at her worriedly. Neil quickly put two and two together and quickly added. There are also tales of dragons being forgiven their crimes and living in peace with the world. Humans, like dragons, come in all forms. Some are good, some are evil, and some are somewhere in between. You've got people who would never commit a crime or do harm to another, those who see things as either black or white, good or evil, yet there are those who see the world in shades of gray, believing that there are necessary evils that must be done to preserve a nation, a person's way of life, or peace in general. This made Cinder again relax, and Spyro gave a small smile before gazing to Hunter. "So then, what do you need us to do?" Hunter shrugged. "I don't know." Neil was about to say something when you landed. "Neil, what was the favor you wanted to ask me?" Neil sighed. It was nothing." Hunter raised an eyebrow at this. "Are you sure?" Neil nodded. "Judging by the faith you have in your comrades, it would be wrong of me to ask that of you." Hunter nodded and let the subject drop, and then looked to the apes still preparing. "So, can you still use your weapon?" Spyro, Cinder, and Sparks looked to the weapons on Neil and then saw a nod. "I still have ammo for the rifle, but not enough to make a dent against the apes. There is an old saying that things forged in peace must also be forged in war. In order to protect those who cannot fight, I must fight in their place." Neil didn't know how, but his hand moved in an arc that drew a rune in the air. The rune glowed a slight orange color, and then his book appeared out of thin air and opened. The phantom quill appeared and tapped patiently on the paper. He glanced at the book and it started writing. "Devices summoned before are used in the common area. To forge a new device, you must first know what you are looking for. Now that I am transcribed with everything you ever read and learned, simply speak what you are looking for and I'll find it. Once that's complete, try to forge it." Neil nodded and caught Sparks's slack-jawed expression before rapidly thinking. "I need a weapon designed for war, something with a large caliber, full auto-capabilities, and can really scare the apes." "I know. Search, Weapons of the Great War, subheading, 1918, European Theater, American Gunsmiths, John Moses Browning." The book did its thing and quickly flipped to a section where a picture of a man was shown, plus a list of weapons and pictures and descriptions by them. Neil nodded. "Okay. Flip to the Browning Automatic Rifle Model 1918. The book did as requested and flipped over 2 pages to show the weapon. Cinder actually looked interested and gazed at the description. Neil then closed his eyes, also seeing the blueprint before him. He placed his hand on the book and nodded. "Keep it like it is. Factory fresh." The book emitted a soft glow, and when he opened his eyes, a brand new bar was sitting on the grass, bipod deployed, with a belt of 8 extra magazines nearby. The book floated to the side, resummoned the quill, and tapped to get Neil's attention. "Why summon that particular weapon?" "According to the knowledge within me, there is also a weapon called the Thompson that would be lighter and just as effective." Neil nodded and hefted the 16-pound weapon in his hands and loading it before replying. "Quite simple. The bar uses a rifle round, the Thompson uses a pistol round. I need something that will scare the living daylights out of the enemy while also assuring myself that once this weapon knocks them down they won't get back up." "Fair enough." Sparks looked to Neil and then to Spyro and twirled one of his fingers around his ear. Neil snorted. "I saw that. No, I'm not crazy. The book is enchanted. I speak to it, it replies in writing." Sparks didn't look convinced, but Spyro and Cinder nodded understandingly. As Neil turned to Skylar and Hunter, he noticed that the apes had finished yelling and screeching and getting into formation and started charging at them, intent on getting into range before the renowned archer race of Avalar start pelting them with arrows. Obviously, they never expected this. Neil deployed the bipod onto a large rock nearby and knelt behind it to steady himself. He set his left hand on the rifle butt, which was snug against his shoulder, and wrapped his right hand around the rifle grip and flipped the safety off. He turned to the dragons behind him and the cheetahs and nodded. "Best cover your ears." The dragons looked to one another curiously, and Hunter and Skylar covered their ears as Neil pulled the trigger. The bar let loose with an incredible burst. Several .30-06 caliber rounds sailed towards the encroaching horde. The apes heard the thunderous, full-auto report of the weapon, and some in front balked at the unfamiliar sound. Even more stopped dead in their tracks as the bullets slammed into the apes in the lead, cutting them down as Neil walked the weapon back and forth across their lines. He stopped only when he had fired the last round out of the 20-round magazine. Sparks had clapped his hands over his ears and was perched on one of Spyro's horns, shouting angrily, "My ears! Ouch, that smarts!" Spyro grimaced. "It's no picnic for us either, Sparks. Hey, look." The ape stopped advancing. Neil saw this and immediately pressed the magazine release, dropped the empty magazine, and loaded a fresh one, but held his fire. An ape leader, armored and dressed differently than the one Neil had seen before, stepped forward. "By order of General Shadra, if you cheat us, surrender the forger, as well as the traitor, Cinder, you may leave alive. You are hopelessly outnumbered. The forger cannot save you all. Protecting him will only get you and those you care deepest about killed. We know that the Purple Menace has yet to reclaim his powers, and that makes him weak. Surrender, and let this fight end today." Neil glanced at Hunter, who drew his bow and loosed an arrow which flew towards the ape leader. Then, suddenly, the ape sidestepped and the arrow struck the ground harmlessly and gazed back to Hunter, an arrogant smirk on his face. "I take that as your answer." The ape turned to his force and waved to the left. To Neil's horror, a group of the apes broke away and started running in the direction towards the cheetah village where Lark and the other hunters had headed. The ape chuckled cruelly. "You may fight us here, in which case you may win, but you will lose your village today." Hunter growled angrily and shot an arrow at the force going for the village. He struck one of the apes, but they paid no heed to their fallen comrade. They had their eyes on their target. Neil scowled and rose, angrily. "You cowards have no honor. You attack a village just because it is there? Rest assured, here and now, I will die before I allow myself or any innocents to fall into Shadra's claws." The ape leader laughed and Spyro and Cinder looked to him. Neil turned to the two. "I have no right to ask the two of you for anything. But I will ask, please, fly to the cheetah village and protect it from attack. Take Hunter and Skylar with you. Either I will hold the main group here, or I will die trying. I won't let them take me alive. If it comes down to it, I'll forge a bomb and blow myself up before they overtake me." Spyro looked at Neil as if he were crazy and then to Hunter. "I'll stay here with Neil, you, Skylar, and Cinder head for the village. He won't hold out very long alone." Hunter nodded, as did Cinder, but Skylar shook his head. "I'm staying." Hunter turned to him. "Why?" "Neil saved my life, remember? I can't just leave him here. I owe it to him to stay and fight." Hunter gave him a serious look. "You know what you are doing, right? You've just made a life debt." Skylar nodded. "I know. It's something I was planning to do anyway. Besides, if Shadra wants Neil, she's not going to stop at threats, she's going to take action. The fact of the matter is that Spyro and Cinder won't always be there beside him. He needs someone who will." Hunter nodded solemnly and looked at Neil. "Take care of him." Neil nodded and turned to Spyro. "You ready? Chances are they won't stay halted for much longer." Spyro nodded. "Do it." Neil cracked his neck once, then aimed down the sights of the bar and aimed it at the ape commander and fired a round. The ape commander smirked when he saw this and turned to one side, but then gasped as he felt the bullet strike him in the body. He turned and glanced down to see a small hole in his armor and growled, "Damn you." He never finished whatever he was going to say as he fell over as 6 more rounds slammed into his body. The apes glanced at their fallen leader and then to Neil and screeched angrily. Neil looked to both Spyro and Skylar and shrugged. "I guess that did it." Skylar nodded and then gazed at his swords. "What do I do? Just wait here for them to close?" Neil looked to him and then to his nearby rifle and shook his head. Skylar, how would you like to be the first of your species to learn how to use a rifle? Skylar, showing no hesitation, stooped down to pick up the Springfield and hefted it experimentally. It's heavier than a bow. Neil nodded. It is indeed. Now, it has a full clip and one in the chamber already. Simply aim at the target you want to hit, make sure the front sight lines up with the back sight, and then squeeze the trigger. To reload, lift the bolt on the right side, slide it back to eject the spent round, push it back forward to chamber a fresh round, lower the bolt to lock it in place, and pull the trigger again. When it comes to the bayonet fixed on the muzzle, if you know how to use a spear, you know how to use a bayonet rifle. Skylar gave a faint smile and nodded before taking a place beside Neil. Neil quickly summoned 16 more bar clips and 10 more Springfield stripper clips and nodded to Spyro. Spyro, since you have no ranged abilities, please remain nearby to protect us when the enemy gets too close. Spyro gazed at him for a moment and nodded, a confident smile on his muzzle. Don't worry. Pterodor says my melee fighting skills are just as good as my elemental skills. I won't let them touch you or Skylar. Neil nodded his thanks and looked to the book. Do you think I should have forged a machine gun instead of the bar? The quill appeared. You are the forger, I am merely your spellbook, although to be honest, a machine gun would have required the tripod, which sadly you do not have enough mana remaining to summon completely. Neil groaned. Figures. By this time, the ape started charging again and Neil cast aside all other thoughts and pulled the trigger, raking the ape soldiers with full auto fire. A rifle report nearby made him glance at Skylar, who was easily shifting the bolt, taking aim, and the firing again in a mirror-perfect image of himself. The rounds weren't perfect, some apes dropped with holes in their arms or legs, and more than a few dropped holding the fork of their legs, but it was clear that Skylar was a fast learner. The bar was also doing its job well. The 20-round magazine may be small, but the hefty round still had enough power to cut any apes before it to shreds. On several occasions, a round actually went through the ape closing and the ape coming behind it. Skylar and Neil made a good team together. By the time the apes were close enough that the ranged weapons were becoming a hindrance, there were few enough that Neil was comfortable drawing his pistol and knuckle duster and closing as was Skylar with the rifle bayonet, and then with a roar Spyro got into the fray. Neil was able to observe Spyro as he fought. He charged the first apes, running them down with his horns, then swung his tail around, clotheslining an ape that was trying to come at his side. He then reared up on his hind legs, clawed to apes with his forelegs, and then charged after one of the other, somewhat larger apes. It was here that Neil got a show. Spyro used his horns to throw the ape into the air, jumped, and then started pummeling it with attack after attack before using his tail in an overhead arc and cracking the ape over the head, sending it rolling into a small group of its fellows. Neil smiled, unable to resist. Strike. Skylar looked to him curiously and Neil smiled embarrassingly. It's something from my world. Skylar nodded and then charged at an ape who was running towards Spyro. Evident allies seeing the dragon as the bigger threat, they all focused on him. Still though, Spyro didn't look like he needed any help. This was evident when, again, Spyro used his tail to knock several opponents back. Then he singled out one straggler who was in better shape than the others, bit into the ape's shoulder, jumped up, used his wings to hover, folded his hind legs up and started mauling the ape with the claws on his feet. There were only 6 or 7 apes remaining and, with their leader fallen, they all took a last glimpse at the 3 who had held them back and then as one turned and ran. As Spyro landed, he gave a growl and a snort at the retreating apes and heard Neil give a low whistle. Remind me to never tick you off. Spyro shook his head and chuckled. I will, but it probably will never happen. I may be a dragon, but I am a patient sort. Neil nodded and then looked back to Skylar, who was looking over the rifle, and then to Neil. Now we must get to the village. Spyro nodded. I can fly and you can run, but what about Neil? I don't think a human can match a cheetah's speed. Neil looked to them both and then looked to the book. I think I can make my own way. The two of you go ahead. Spyro and Skylar nodded and took off. Neil then looked to the book and sighed. They needed to get to the village and help the defenders. I know I'd only slow them down. Damn it. I wish I had something that could get me there quickly. The book appeared before him, pen at the ready, and wrote 3 little words. It is time. Neil felt his eyes suddenly grow heavy and close against his wishes. Through his eyelids, he saw a flash of light and felt his surroundings change. 8888888888 dash asterisk underscore 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 88888888 underscore asterisk 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 dash 88888888. This time, when Neil opened his eyes, he wasn't on the plains of Avalar. He was in a building the likes of which he'd never seen before. He glanced around and saw machinery littered around him. There was a workbench, tools, devices, and piles upon piles of metals, iron, steel, copper, lead, brass, bronze, even gold and silver. In a corner were piles of books haphazardly tossed about, with rolls and rolls of blueprint paper sat on a desk with a fountain pen and a little wire device that held 2 containers of ink. One was white ink, the other black. Neil gazed around in wonder and then saw his book floating nearby. What is this place? The book opened and the ghostly quill started writing. This is your workshop. Up until now, you have been forging from memory, quickly creating what you needed to accomplish the job at hand. Now that you are getting used to the world and your powers, it is time for you to come here. You are the first to be in this place, but you are hardly the first in your family considered a forger. Suddenly, a gray specter appeared and started working on the workbench, his hands moving as if assembling something. Across from him, another gray specter, this time a woman, started reaching up and working on something else. Soon, there were several specters and each started working on several invisible creations. All the while as Neil watched, the book wrote. When it finished, it tapped to get his attention. Neil turned and silently read what it had written. Martin B. Edwards, 1750–1781, farrier/swordsmith, Georgia Militia/Patriot Army, killed in action. Richard S. Edwards, 1779–1814, blacksmith, U.S. Army, Louisiana, killed in action. Thomas L. Edwards, 1813–1842, weaponsmith, Texas Volunteer Army, killed in action. Edward G. Edwards, 1840–1898, corporal, Confederate Army, later served as a shipbuilder, USS Bainbridge, then U.S. Navy petty officer. Killed in action on USS Maine. George R. Edwards Sr., 1861–1918, motorcycle technician/tank mechanic, Master Sergeant, American Expeditionary Force. Died of heart attack on November 11, 1918, upon news of the loss of his son. George R. Edwards Jr., 1882–1918, pilot, flight lieutenant, American Expeditionary Force, killed in action November 10, 1918. Amelia Edwards Foster, 1915–1952, aircraft assembly technician, World War II, volunteer nurse, U.S. Army Medical Corps. Killed in action, Korea. Joseph P. Foster, 1950–2004, weapons officer, senior chief petty officer, U.S. Navy. Killed in action, Iraq. Neil caught himself as he felt himself leaning as he saw his father's name in his book. Slowly, the specters took on faces and clothes, and the projects they were working on came to light. He looked to his father's specter and started to tear up. There, in his father's lap, was the last rifle he and his father had ever worked on together, a World War I issue German Mauser 98 rifle. The last memory of him jumped unbidden to mind. It had been Monday, September 10th, 2001. The next day, the world as he had known it shattered. His father re-enlisted in the Navy, went to war, and never came home again. Neil had never again touched that rifle. In an effort to get him to move on, his mother had sold it shortly before her death, but it hadn't helped. The same war had claimed his father and his brother. The tapping on the book brought him back to reality, and he gazed around at the other things his ancestors were working on. His great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was working on a badly blunted cavalry saber. His great-great-great-great-grandfather was repairing a busted artillery carriage. His great-great-great-grandfather was trying to repair what looked like components to a large steam engine. His great-great-grandfather was working on a French FT-17 tank that had been transferred to an American command. The letter and number designation was G11. His great-grandfather was working on a SPAD-8 biplane that had painted on it, of all things, the family crest, a white shield, with two dragons, red and blue, with the phrase "Never Say Die" in gold lettering underneath. On the fuselage were 4 German crosses, 4 kills. One shy of making him an ace. Lastly, the only woman in the group, his grandmother, was busy working on an American B-17 Flying Fortress ball turret. He silently walked to the desk and suddenly found himself looking over the blueprints. There were detailed diagrams of several WW1-era weapons, aircraft, vehicles, and even a few WW2-era aircraft. With the specters of his ancestors milling about around him, seemingly oblivious to his prescience, he turned to the book. I need a vehicle. Something fast, light, easy to control. Something that can keep up with a dragon on the wing, and a cheetah running at full speed. Something that can get me to where I'm needed in one hell of a hurry. A chuckle filled the room, and suddenly the specter of George Edwards Sr. turned to face him, the gray pallor draining from him, color returning to his face, his uniform, his hair, and his eyes. The specter produced a rag from his back pocket and started wiping seemingly fresh grease from his hands. The grease and oil-stained man chuckled and walked towards Neil and smiled. If it's a vehicle you're after, I reckon I've got what you need. George Edwards Sr. pointed to an open space on the floor of the workshop, and in a flash a vehicle appeared. As Neil gazed at it in wonder, George Edwards smiled. Something I had planned to bring home when the war was over. Never got to ride it, of course, but, well, better late than never. All the vehicles I ever worked on, nothing was faster than a Harley-Davidson. As an added bonus, this one has a Thompson fitted to it. She was used as a high-speed courier to transit orders. She's got bark and bite. As George Edwards turned away, the gray color began to return as he walked back to the workbench. If you take care of her, she'll take care of you. As the gray color finished, George Edwards fell silent. Neil nodded to him and walked to the motorcycle and placed a hand on the distinctive handlebars and heard someone cough behind him. He turned and saw Edward Edwards, clad in Confederate gray, standing before him, a serious expression on his face. We in our family have always been drawn to machinery. A desire to see what makes things work. We didn't know it then, but we have always been forgers. Now, that title falls to you. Remember to always show honor, compassion, and courage, and you will never disgrace it. Neil nodded to him and then placed a hand on his clothes. In a flash, the ghillie suit had transformed into a World War I-era uniform, complete with helmet, gas mask, and trench coat. He even had a metal cuirass over his chest. He mounted the motorcycle and, with a strong kick, the engine started. He revved the motor a few times and checked the Thompson to make sure it was loaded and smiled, looking to the book. Let's go protect the village. Skylar and Spyro had arrived back at the village just in time to see Cinder finish off the first wave with a wall of shadow fire. The apes had mustered into a formidable defense despite being somewhat few in number. Once Cinder saw them, she relaxed, as did the archers on the walls.
As Spyro landed, Sparks flew over to him and took a perch on one of his horns and chuckled. "Spyro, it is good to see you. So, I take it that the other apes we left back there are defeated? Oh, wait a moment, where's our forger friend? Did he not make it?" Spyro shook his head. "No, he told us to go ahead and that he'd be here soon, but I guess I should have figured that Cinder and the cheetahs would have things well under control." At that moment, Lark arrived and nodded to Skylar and Spyro. "Well, he'd best arrive quickly then, because the fun's almost over." Cinder grimaced at that and then pointed a wingtip to the apes in the distance. "I think they're just getting started, getting a feel for our defenses. They've tested the waters, now they're about to dive in." Sparks groaned. Why must you sound depressing like that? Maybe they're hanging back because they are going to retreat?" A loud roar pierced the sky, making Sparks scream. "What was that?" Spyro growled as he caught the scent and gazed up. "Wyverns. At least 8 of them, dreadwings as well." Cinder frowned. "We've got no choice but to split up. Spyro, you and I are the only ones who can deal with airborne threats. That means the cheetahs are back to being outnumbered on the ground. We need something to balance the scales. Even the odds." Spyro opened his mouth to say something but was stopped as he heard something like a distant growl. The growl got closer and louder until it turned into a full-fledged roar. Sparks gazed around worriedly, and even the cheetahs were looking around for the source of the noise. Then, a series of whoops and yells got their attention as the apes started advancing, and above the dreadwings and wyverns dropped below the clouds. The apes had passed an outer fence when a familiar sound pierced the air. A low-flying wyvern screeched, did a wing over, plummeted from the sky, and crashed into a hay bale. The apes stopped and looked up to the hills across from the village, and the dreadwings and wyverns started hovering as if trying to understand what had just happened. Then the roaring sound was heard again and, with a sudden increase in pitch, Spyro, Cinder, and the others watched as Neil, astride some sort of metal machine, crested the hill, sailed through the air for a bit before landing, and then, shifting his left hand from the bar controlling the front wheel, he grabbed the weapon, bolted to the middle of the bar, and shifted his aim and fired. Rounds from the Thompson raked the ape ranks and tore through them easily. After a moment, he released the weapon to regain stability of the motorcycle and headed for the village. As he neared, he applied the handbrake and slid to a stop near the 2 dragons and gave them a grin. "Am I late?" Sparks hovered down to look at him, then looked to the apes, then up to the creatures in the sky, and then back to Neil and shrugged. "No, you're just in time. Nice entry, though." Neil nodded and then dropped the kickstand, unslung the bar, and held it at the hip. "So, Spyro, Cinder, I guess you'll take the flying foes and we'll handle the flea circus." Cinder smiled and chuckled at that joke and nodded. "Yeah. We'll handle the flyers, you handle the fleas." Neil glanced at Skylar and Hunter and chuckled. "Ain't the worst job I've had to do." With a lunge, Spyro and Cinder shot into the sky towards the airborne foes, and Neil leveled the bar at the apes who, having overcome their shock and confusion, began running at the village. Again. Neil saw the cheetahs frown as the apes were still out of range of their bows, and he gave a sympathetic nod. "Y'all just watch the show. Skylar, you up for raising a little hell?" Skylar nodded and leveled the Springfield rifle at the apes and opened fire. Neil joined in by raking the bar back and forth along the apes. He caught a glimpse of the looks of the cheetahs on the wall and probably would have laughed at their expressions if the situation wasn't so serious. A screech got his attention momentarily as he saw Spyro, Dreadwing in a death grip, flying low and fast at the ape formation and then releasing it. The creature's momentum carried it the rest of the way, and it bowled into the apes who shrieked and howled and cursed both the creature and Spyro who, with 3 flaps of his wings, was back in the air and out of range of their attacks. Moments later another screech broke through and a wyvern fell, clawing at its face where Cinder's poison had been sprayed point blank. As Neil fired the last rounds from the clip and then started to reload, a shadow fell over him. "Neil! Look out!" Pure instinct drove Neil to hearken to Spyro's call as he dove to the side as a wyvern's claws dug furrows in the earth where he'd been standing moments before. Neil rose to his feet, took a step towards the motorcycle, unfastened the bolt from the Thompson, and, hefting it like the bar earlier, he raised the weapon upward just as the wyvern was coming back for another pass and held down the trigger, emptying the entire 50-round drum into the creature. The wyvern swerved, cartwheeled through the air and, whether through luck or coincidence, landed in the exact same hay bale as the first and remained there. Neil saw this and gave a small grin. Puts a whole new meaning to the phrase "hit the hay." The Thompson now expended, he set it aside and re-readied the bar and loaded a fresh clip into the weapon and resumed firing. By this time, the apes were now in range of the village and the cheetahs along the wall were loosing volley after volley of expertly aimed arrows at the enemy. The gates to the village opened and several more cheetahs came out, swords, spears, and axes at the ready. Above the village, Spyro could see that the battle was almost over. The majority of the apes were dead and some were starting to retreat from the field, and of the flying enemies, few remained. He saw Cinder grappling with a wyvern and he grabbed a dreadwing and flew in her direction. Seeing him coming towards her, she started flying towards him, and then as they closed they threw their respective opponents at each other and couldn't help but laugh as the two creatures collided in mid-air and then fell down below and created a sizable impact crater in a nearby hilltop. This impact was the last straw for the apes and the rest of them turned and fled for their lives. The cheetahs, seeing this, began cheering loudly. Neil joined in the cheering and above, Spyro and Cinder roared triumphantly, circling the village overhead. As Neil gazed upwards to watch them fly, he felt that old familiar feeling in his chest. The absolute joy and freedom of flight. On the ground, seeing the two of them circle one another as they flew overhead, it was almost hypnotic in a fashion. He felt Skylar clap his shoulder roughly, but all he gave the cheetah was a small smile and a nod before his knees gave out and he slumped to the ground against the motorcycle. His eyes slid closed and he was asleep. 88888888 underscore asterisk 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 dash 88888888 dash asterisk underscore asterisk asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore 88888888. Neil suddenly came to a place he recognized even though he'd only seen it once. The stone library where he'd met Ignitus. He gazed around slowly looking for the elder dragon and found him at a desk examining a book. Or more precisely, the book. Neil approached and cleared his throat, which got a nod from Ignitus. "How did I wind up back here?" Ignitus chuckled. "You overextended yourself and your body went into A." The teal dragon flipped through a book that suddenly Neil recognized as a copy of Webster's dictionary. Ignitus stopped at a page and nodded. "As I was saying, you overtaxed yourself and your body went into A. Energy-saving mode. Simply, you wore yourself out, you fell asleep to conserve what energy you had left and recharge." Neil nodded but couldn't suppress the chuckle of seeing the big teal dragon flipping through multiple books that seemingly came from his world. "Studying up, I presume?" Ignitus chuckled and gave a nod. "Indeed. I must say, you humans are not the nightmarish creatures my race tends to believe you to be. I must admit, Neil, when I first saw you I was unsure of what I should do. I wanted to see what type of person you are. In a way, I was testing you." Neil nodded. "Seems to be a common trend in this world of yours. I suppose I'll have to look forward to such treatment once we get to Warfang, right?" Ignitus sighed. "I'm afraid that may be the case. Fortunately, your actions have swayed Spyro and Cinder, convincing them that you are a friend and trust me that counts for a lot with the other Guardians. You have also befriended Hunter, Skylar, Lark, and even Chief Prowless who, at this very moment, is checking up on you to make sure you are in fine health, just sleeping. Anyway, in case you were wondering, yes, technically, you are what the cheetahs know as an Atorker. However, the magic that you possess is fundamentally dragon magic. The situation in its own right is interesting. I wouldn't be surprised at all if, once Voltaire overcomes his initial shock, pun intended, he may start bombarding you with questions. Neil nodded. Skylar said there were other species in the world. What would they call me? Ignitus gazed at him and then gazed around the library before nodded and surprised Neil by summoning a book that was as thick as he was tall. As for the first part of that query, yes, there are many other races that inhabit our world. Some friendly, some less so, and some downright hostile. To the dragons, you are a forger. The cheetahs, a torker. The moles and manweersmals both know one of your talents as Uberman. The Atloa know it as Danicer. The canines as Maester, and the wolves as Alphium. There are a few others, but they exist on far distant continents beyond my influence. Neil took a deep breath before sighing. I have something else to ask you. In human culture, we believe that all stories, in particular our fictions, have at least some grain of truth to them. Are there other humans in this world? Ignitus gave a weary sigh and summoned another book. I've actually been able to answer that very question for myself. Long ago, even before Malfor himself was even a thought, yes, humans existed in our realm. However, those days are long gone. Again, there might still be some tribes on far distant lands, but none here, I'm afraid. Between some time before Malfor's hatching and the Great Uniting, humans mysteriously went extinct on our lands. Now, granted, we dragons had no love for humans in those days, but it was said that the way they died made even the ancestors pity them. It was as if they simply wasted away. Ignitus summoned several books and laid them out before himself and Neil. Some books I have from around that time suggest they contracted some mysterious disease that dragons could have cured and died out. Others speculate that ancient dragons used magic to create a plague that only targeted humans. Either way, it is something that, in this day and age, would have never been condoned. Ignitus closed the books and sent them back to their shelves. Now, humans and dragons rarely, if ever, got along in ancient times. Yet, I can't help but be curious as to why the ancestors, when Malfor was bearing down on them, sent the forge magic to a different world where humans dominated the world and dragons were extinct, or simply never existed. Perhaps it was a way of denying Malfor, or perhaps they foresaw a day when humans would return and wanted to make amends for the past. Still, the humans of old may be gone, but the stories remain. Once you get to Warfang, I would advise you not to leave Spyro or Cinder's side, or, if you have to, seek out company with another species. The cheetahs and possibly the wolves immediately come to mind. Neil mentally made a check by make friends with the race of bipedal cheetahs. Ignitus continued. Dragons consider humans a way to get their hatchlings to behave, like, go to bed on time or the humans will hatchling nap you or eat your vegetables or you'll be too weak when the humans come to take you away. Things of that nature. Anyway, to discover one alive, much less in possession of powerful dragon magic, well, it would be a rather nasty scare to a lot of people. Neil didn't suppress his shudder. I don't like the sound of that. How nasty a scare are we talking about? Ignitus tapped a foreclaw thoughtfully. How to put this, delicately, the more militaristic-minded dragons will want you executed outright. A female with children may also lash out with element, fang, claw, or tail. There is also a tribe of dragons to the far west, the ones that use poison. Well, they believe that consuming their victim will grant them the powers of that person. Neil paled. So, stay east to avoid getting eaten by venomous tribal dragons, who boy and here I was thinking those old stories were just that. Stories. Ignitus chuckled. Well, as you said, every story, no matter how outlandish, has to have a bit of truth somewhere. Neil nodded. Is there a way to allay their fears? Maybe show them that I'm a forger and that I mean them no harm? Ignitus went wide-eyed and shook his head rapidly, his calm voice growing into a thundering roar. No. Under no circumstances whatsoever are you to reveal to every dragon and dragoness in all creation that you are a forger. Ignitus hadn't meant to roar, but he had, and Neil had shrunk back. Seeing this, Ignitus sighed and then explained. There is a magic out there, a dark magic, capable of ripping someone's magical energies from them and imbuing them into another. If dragons catch wind that a human of all things is a forger and they're not prepared for it, they may just try and dig into those forbidden tomes, and I doubt any dragon, save Voltaire and perhaps Terrador, would stop them. If they were to use the magic on you, well, let's just say that in all the cases I've read of that magic being used, none have survived the experience. The Guardians are the only dragons you should tell outright of your powers. Neil then sighed. So then, back to the original question, how do I dispel their fear? Ignitus sighed. That's a multiple-choice question right there. Some dragons, though I hate to say it, can be bought. We usually have no use for gold and silver, but we do use it for decoration, and we use gems for currency. Present a particularly beautiful piece of art to the right dragoness, and she'll tell her friends, and they'll tell their friends, and word will spread that you're quite the artist, thus making you unique, more of an oddity, but still effective. There are also dragons whose vanity is their weakness. Speak nicely of someone or stroke an important figure's ego, and they'll think you might actually be civilized. Neil had a feeling that sounded familiar, but bit his tongue. With most dragons, however, respect must be earned. It may be painful to do, but share your memories with them, tales about your land. Some little ones can even be enthralled by stories about far-off places in your world. If we dragons are anything at all, we're curious by nature, and our young ones have an immense sense of adventure and wanderlust. Once they feel comfortable around you, you may find Spyro and Cinder listening to you tell stories one of these days. Neil chuckled. Nothing like a good mystery, riddle, joke, pun, or story, eh? Ignitus chuckled. Indeed. Plus, some dragons will simply be satisfied knowing about your race. Voltaire is one of those types of dragons. Neil then thought of something. These guardians, what are they like? Ignitus nodded. A sensible question. Well, Voltaire is an electric dragon, as you may have figured out. Very studious, intelligent, and always eager to learn something he didn't know before. Plus, I believe the human term, if I read this correctly, he's a motormouth. Neil slapped his forehead. I had an aunt like that. Always talking and impossible to stop once she got rolling. Like a boulder. Or an avalanche. Ignitus nodded. Quite. Now then, next is, oh, before I forget, don't tell Cyril that I spoke of Voltaire before him. Cyril, amongst the Guardians, is the only high-ranking noble among them, and he doesn't let anyone forget it. He's very particular about the proud ancestral lineage of the ice dragons. Neil nodded. In short, he's pompous. Ignitus barked a laugh at the blunt phrase and nodded, still chuckling. If he ever heard you say that, you'd learn a whole new meaning to the term frostbite. Aha, now then, the next is Terrador, the Earth Guardian. While Voltaire was the scholar and Cyril was the noble, Terrador was the soldier. I know this may sound somewhat presumptuous, but, when you meet him, you may manage to curry favor with him if you wore your military uniform. Soldiers are oftentimes sympathetic to others who have seen the same things as they. Neil nodded and then looked back to him. That's electricity, ice, and earth. How many other guardians are there? There are others. The next one is Furnace, the fire guardian, and my replacement.
He is a little bit of everything, eh? Jack of all trades. I believe is the human expression, right? Neil nodded and Ignitus continued. He's a teacher, philosopher, soldier, artist, and I believe he once even tried blacksmithing. He's good at many things, but alas is a master of none. His students only achieve slightly higher than average grades, his poetry is recited in only very small circles, he never achieved the status that Terador did, nor did he become an officer in the military, his metalwork was mediocre at best and his artwork is best not examined on a full stomach, if you catch my meaning. Neil made a mental note of that and then waited. What about wind? Water? Ignitus gave a small grin and nodded, glad to see Neil taking an interest in the subject. The aqua dragons are renowned healers and are also some of the largest dragons of the species. They use water to create a variety of poultices, elixirs, potions, and medicines, all of which are entirely potable and easy to swallow. The water guardian is a massive aqua dragon named Leviathan. He is, among other things, one of the greatest healers his race has ever produced, as well as one of the largest aqua dragons alive today. I've noticed that your military service lists you as a pararescueman who pulled injured and adrift sailors and civilians from the ocean. There's a good chance that bit of information will earn you his approval, as all aqua dragons are trained from hatching to seek out ships in distress and rescue their crews whenever nearby. Neil shuddered at that, but then sighed. Yeah, but when it came down to it, the most important rescue of my career, and I failed horribly. Ignitus looked to him curiously. Sorry, did you say something? Neil shook his head and motioned for the chronicler to continue. The Wind Guardian is Gust. She's one of 2 female guardians and she, like Cyril, is nobility. However, she is not set in her opinions. In the end she will decide whatever her heart tells her to do. She's a very relaxed dragoness and easy to get along with. Also, she's the youngest and also the most acrobatic. She loves pushing herself when she flies or hunts. Neil nodded. Sounds like my brother. Perhaps she'd like to hear about a few of his missions he told me about, or perhaps a few instances when I was a stunt pilot. Any others? Ignitus nodded. Lastly, there is a Shadow Guardian. Her name is Constance, short for Constellation. Now, be warned with her, she is a dragoness of few words, a short temper, and a long memory. Plus, she's Cinder's mother. Now, a good way to read Constance is to read Cinder. If you've been polite to Cinder, she'll greet you with unrestrained warmth. However, if you've been cold and cruel to her, ancestors only know how she does, but she knows. Neil chuckled. One of the most infallible things in the world is a mother's intuition and love. Ignitus paused and gazed at Neil curiously. Wise words indeed. Who said them? Neil smiled. My mother. Ignitus nodded. Constance deeply regrets not being there for her daughter in her youth. You doubtlessly now know about Cinder's past. Tell me, if you had bore witness to what she had committed, would you have forgiven her, despite the fact that she worked so hard to repair what she had done? Neil gazed at the dragon, searching for a clue, but in the end he found none, but in the end he nodded. I could tell by her voice that she is an honest dragoness and that she cares deeply for Spyro. If one is truly repentant of their past, then forgiving them is the first step towards moving forward. Ignitus nodded. Well then, that basically means that Cyril should be your only obstacle when you meet the Guardians. Although, chances are they will also have you brought before the leaders of the combined races of the realms. Neil nodded and then watched as the library began to fade. Ignitus? What's happening? You're waking up. Your mana has recharged itself and quite simply, you cannot stay in one place for too long now. Shadra knows where you are now. Also, the Guardians have learned of the 8 precincts in the area and have sent soldiers to escort Spyro and Cinder back to Warfang. Though it won't be admitted easily, without his powers Spyro is an easy target for the apes and Shadra. Ancestors guide you. 8888888888 underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk dash 88888888 dash asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk underscore asterisk dash 8 dash 8 dash 8 dash 8 dash 8 dash 8. Neil awoke in the same hut he had woken up in before, only this time he spotted Skylar by his door and his belongings nearby. Once he sat up, Skylar grinned to him and nodded. Good you're awake. Your book explained to us why you fell unconscious, and we gently carried you back here. Chief Prowlus dropped by earlier to make sure you were all right. He may not show it if you see him later, but he's very relieved you helped out when you did. One of the female healers undressed you to take your clothes for cleaning and checked you over for wounds. Thankfully you were uninjured. Neil nodded and eased himself out of bed and then heard a faint ticking noise. He glanced over to his belongings and saw the watch he had created earlier that day and had handed over to Mistra to be enchanted. Skylar noticed the watch and nodded. Mistra dropped it off earlier. Said that in the event such a thing happens again, the watch will warn you. As Neil strapped the watch on, he felt a tingling sensation throughout his body and noticed the hands on the watch turning independently. After a moment, the hand stopped at precisely 12 o'clock, and then the fourth hand that acted as the mana gauge slowly crawled clockwise from the red portion of the face to the yellow, then to the green section before stopping at the 12, meaning he had full mana reserves. He gazed at Skylar. What time of day is it? Skylar glanced at him and noticed the watch and said, Around midday. Neil chuckled. Mistra must have also enchanted the watch to keep perfect time. I'll have to thank her later. Skylar chuckled at that and shook his head. No need. When the hunters explained how we were able to attain so many kills, the people were ecstatic. With the deer you killed plus the boars, and with helping fend off the attack, you've become a hero to the village. Neil chuckled. I never would have figured myself to be a hero in my life. I suppose there's a time for everything. Now then, I guess I'll step outside for a bit. As Neil rose, Skylar got a serious look on his face. Neil, be careful. A group of dragons arrived from Warfang with the Guardian of Shadows at the lead, and they intend to escort Spyro and Cinder back to Warfang. Well, you'll need to see this for yourself. Neil nodded to him and took a deep breath as he put on a fresh set of clothes, ironically another World War I uniform, this time French, and started for the door. He had no idea what to expect when he opened that door. As he opened it, he was quickly aware of 8 cheetahs nearby who, once they saw him, nodded politely and formed ranks beside him. Gazing across the village, he spotted 8 dragons clad in armor in the village square and another unarmored dragon speaking with Hunter. Another cheetah he guessed was Chief Prowlus, and Spyro and Cinder. As Skylar came out and joined the cheetahs with him, Neil took a steadying breath and started towards the group. No sooner had they reached the square when one of the armored dragons stopped to take a deep smell of the air and faced the group. Instantly, the dragon's expression changed from one of confusion to realization, and then to horror. Human. Immediately the dragons at first glared at the dragon and the commander, a female, growled at the dragon for spouting nonsense, but then caught sight of Neil and went just as wide-eyed with shock as the previous dragon and then glanced to the unarmored dragoness nearby. Lady Constance. Constance, the Guardian of Shadow, from her relaxed position before her daughter and Spyro, turned to face the soldiers and then to the cheetahs and Neil. Her eyes narrowed, she took several deep breaths, likely taking a good sample of his scent, Neil realized, and then let out one great whoosh of breath as she rose to her full height. Whereas Spyro and Cinder were able to see him eye to eye as they could with the cheetahs, Constance, and indeed the other dragons here, towered over him. In human world retrospect,
Constance was as tall and as long from nose to tail as an 18-wheeler. Despite himself, Neil felt his heart fall through his chest at the sight of so many dragons that, if he made the wrong move, could and would likely kill him without a second thought, and there would be nothing the cheetahs could do to stop them. Taking a few steps forward, she bent her head forward to examine Neil more closely, eyes betraying nothing but wary alertness, but also curiosity. She took one more sharp sniff and then exhaled, the force of the wind nearly rocking Neil back on his heels and blowing his hair back for a moment. Then she spoke. "For a creature out of our worst nightmares, you're awfully tiny." Neil gave a small smile and glanced up to her. "There is a saying among my race, to never judge someone by their outward appearance. Then again, we usually place more belief in actions, and, if I were a gambling man, you seem as curious about me as I am curious about this world." One of the nearest soldiers growled a warning, but Constance silenced him with a glance and then returned Neil's smile with one of her own. "Indeed, and may I ask, are you a gambling man?" Neil chuckled. "I prefer games of sport over games of chance. Besides, I have rather abominable luck, but that still doesn't stop me. Do I find you intimidating?" "Yes." "Do I find your escorts intimidating?" Again, yes. Neil heard the soldier dragon murmur something and saw more than one of them smirk. Neil ignored this though. "However, the very fact of our conversation means that you are interested as to the reason, or perhaps how a human, a being supposedly extinct in this world, would throw himself into harm's way time and again for people he knows absolutely nothing about. The answer is a simple one. I am no threat to you, your kind, or these cheetahs who have graciously extended to me their hospitality these past few days." Constance nodded lightly and then gave a glance to her daughter before returning her gaze to Neil. "So then, my daughter tells me that you have asked her and Spyro for their protection, yet you know nothing about them, this world, or our kind." "Why?" A dragon behind her scoffed and muttered something under his breath, and then, quick as a whip, her eyes sharpened and she wheeled around quick as a whip and bared her fangs at him menacingly. "Do not dare speak that way of my daughter in my presence." Neil saw the dragon mutter an apology and back away. Then he mustered his courage and gave a smile. "She's lucky." Constance wheeled back around and gave Neil the same dagger-like glare. "What I mean is to have a mother like you, she's lucky." Constance went wide-eyed at that, all the tension draining from her as Neil's words sunk in. Emboldened, he continued, "I learned a little about your daughter in passing, and, as you've said, I know little to nothing about you, your species, or this world, but from what I can tell at first glance, despite those who say things about her, I can tell she is a good-natured sort and would do whatever necessary to atone for what happened. And that, she has my respect. She is also not alone in that regard." Neil gazed around at the other dragons. "My name is Neil Foster, formerly Chief Petty Officer and Pararescue Man of the United States Coast Guard." Neil glanced to the dragon soldiers, to Spyro and Cinder, then back to Constance. "I swore an oath, a long time ago, to uphold law and order, defend the defenseless, uphold the weak, give aid to those who ask of it, and to never let the cry of a soul in distress cry out in vain, and to hang on to them, through sea and storm, fire and foe, until help arrived. I have saved lives and I have taken them in defense of my country, my ship, and my comrades. I spoke to your daughter, and to Spyro, requesting their protection both because I know nothing about this world and because of something else. I was brought here to this world by the chronicler, and instructed by him to seek these two out once I got my bearings. Guardian Constance, I also request your understanding of my situation. My family has long been drawn to machinery, technology, and the like. It was only with my coming to this world that I learned why. During the original war against the dragon Malfor, the ancestors sealed away a special type of magic. Forge magic." Constance nodded calmly, indicating for him to continue. Whether they meant to or just coincidence,
they sealed it in my world. I am a human, yes, but I am also a forger. Constance snapped her gaze to him, then turned to her soldiers who stared aghast at the proclamation. Lieutenant, you and those under your command are hereby sworn to secrecy. She returned her gaze to Neil, her eyes radiating amazement but also concern. Human. Neil, can you confirm this? Has forge magic returned to our world? Neil nodded, stepped away to make some space, took a moment to visualize what he wanted, something large, obviously human in origin, and visually impressive. The book aided him by combing through things his ancestors had known, and soon he had what he wanted. As he began channeling the magic, a circle of light appeared on the ground, which turned into a sphere, and then, with a soft whomp, it was done. Constance, the dragons with her, as well as the cheetahs, were shocked speechless. A small bell sounded on Neil's wrist, and he glanced at his watch and saw the fourth hand, the one that measured his mana, drop from the 12 mark, full mana, to the 10 mark. Though the drop was expected, Neil expected summoning a large object to have dropped his mana at least to the 6, which was the end of the green zone and the start of the yellow zone. Not so bad. I guess I have more mana than I thought. Constance examined what Neil had created, looking over the automobile, and then glosséd back to him. Impressive. May I ask what it is? Neil nodded. This is what we humans called an automobile. They were first introduced in the years before the Great War and were used to shuttle soldiers and supplies to the front lines, and were also used for scouting. Constance nodded. Interesting. So, how does it work? Neil came forward and undid the bolts on the hood. The vehicle is powered by this engine here. To start it, I turn the crank here on the front, the engine starts, and the pistons and gears start turning the wheels. If I may? Neil pointed to the crank and Constance nodded. He reached down to the crank, turned it once, twice, then 3 times. The engine remained inert. Then, on the 4th try, the report of combustion echoed, making Neil smile, and on the 5th, the engine finally started. Pistons marched up and down, valves opened and closed, the engine was purring like a dream. Constance examined the vehicle with stoic calm while the others looked on with amazement until Neil shut it off. As the engine stopped, Constance nodded to him. So, you have asked my daughter for protection. May I ask why? Neil nodded. It seems that for some reason, Chandra believes that, as a forger, I can create something that can free Malfor from his prison. Rest assured, even if I knew something that would do that, I would never even consider it. Constance had frowned when he'd said the earlier, but relaxed when he said the last, and nodded. Well, at the moment Spyro is still recovering from the last battle with Malfor. It was wise to ask them for help, but, for the moment, it may fall to us Guardians to keep you safe. That is if you can convince Cyril. Now then, we've finished our reason for coming here. We'll be flying back to Warfang soon. I suppose since you don't have a clue how to get to Warfang, one of us will have to carry you. Neil gave her an incredulous look and then a small smile. I'd appreciate it. Heh, riding a dragon, one thing off the bucket list. Constance looked to him curiously. Bucket list? What's that? Neil blushed. It's something humans do occasionally. We make a list of things we'd most like to do before we die. I've been in more near-death experiences than I can count, but I only made a bucket list after the last crash. Spyro and Cinder looked to him. Crash? What happened? Neil looked to them and grimaced. It's something that happened a couple of years ago. It's something that I'm ashamed of, to be honest. Remember how I said that you are not alone and that you have things you believe you have to atone for? This instance was mine. Constance eyed him curiously. Well, we've got time. Neil glanced at her and then noticed the other dragons paying attention, as well as Hunter and Skylar inside, realizing there was no way around it.
He'd opened Pandora's box, and now he just had to roll with it. It was my last mission in the Coast Guard. We were responding to a distress call from an old cargo ship that had gotten swamped by a rogue wave and was sinking fast. The day started out so clear, so beautiful. We had no idea we were flying into a storm that was forming. By the time we reached the location of the radio call, the ship was gone, the wind was howling, thunder crashing everywhere, lightning illuminating the sky, and rain so heavy you couldn't see 6 feet in front of you. The ocean was whitecapping, heaving. He sighed as he worked on unforging the armored car. To this day I still don't know what happened. Maybe water got sucked into the engine intakes, or maybe the mechanics didn't do a proper check, or maybe just simple bad luck. We had the doors open, spotlights scanning the waves looking for survivors. Suddenly there was this loud grinding noise, and all the alarms started going off. Next thing I know, we were in free fall, engines had died, we were spinning like a top. Neil had tears coming into his eyes at that point. My best friends from my childhood were with me that day. I was the co-pilot, Mills was the pilot, and the officer in charge. Hawkins was the spotlight operator, and the new guy, Edwards, was the diver. When we started spinning, momentum tore Hawkins out of the chopper. We were still at 100 feet in the air. When he hit the water, it was like hitting a stone wall at high speed. A few of the dragons grimaced, realizing where he was going. The impact broke his back, didn't kill him, not right away. The tears were now visible, and the dragons eyed him curiously. We must have tried every damn thing we could think of to restart the engines, but it all failed. We hit the water hard, canopy shattered, flooding the cockpit. A piece of the frame broke loose, impaling Mills and pinning him to his seat. He couldn't get out. Neil looked to Constance and then to Skylar and Hunter. I watched my best friend drown, and I wasn't even a foot away from him. He took a deep breath and continued. Next thing I knew, the straps holding me in my seat broke loose, current carried me out before the chopper sank, broke my leg and my hip in the crash, found Edwards trying to get Hawkins into an emergency life raft that broke loose in the free fall. He was battered, bloody. I should have been more alert. I tried to triage Hawkins, but the sea was too rough. I couldn't help him. Then I saw something out the corner of my eye, a fin, piercing the water. I tried to yell at Edwards to get into the raft, but it was too late. Neil was pale now, and his hands were shaking fiercely. I watched as a shark grabbed his leg and pulled him under, away from the raft. It let him go, and his vest brought him back to the surface. Even to this day I can still hear him screaming. That just seemed to encourage them. There were 3 of them, and they devoured him right in front of me. A lithe female dragon nearby went green in the face and ran behind a nearby bush as what he said registered. I must have passed out from the shock, but when I came to, Hawkins was gasping for breath and clutching his chest. Somehow I knew that a rib had punctured something, didn't have the medical kit, went down with the chopper. He died in my arms, sobbing in pain, begging me for help, and I couldn't do a damn thing. Neil's voice broke and he went to his knees. If he had glanced around, he would have seen that even the dragons who had been growling at him earlier now had tears in their eyes. Even Constance. Neil took a few breaths to collect himself. I was found the next day. I relayed everything that had happened to the commander from my infirmary bed. Doc said that the physical wounds would heal readily enough, but they believed the stress was too much. I was discharged without a second thought. I guess it was as gentle a dismissal as they could give me. Word had it people were wondering what the hell we were doing in that storm in the first place. Losing the chopper was bad enough, but losing my entire crew was worse. Some of the powers that be were calling for a tribunal, or, failing that, my head on a pole. He gave one last sigh and gazed at his left hand, seeing the scar on his palm from when he had cut it trying to save Hawkins. I live my life, not just for myself, but for the 3 friends I lost that day. 3 comrades. I had to face their mothers, wives, children, and tell them what happened. Some simply sobbed at their losses. Edward's wife, though, she cursed me out 6 ways from Sunday, calling me every curse word in the book. Even a few I didn't know. I live for them, because they never got to see so many things. Neil was suddenly aware of something blotting out the sun and gazed up to a shock. Constance had half unfurled a wing and had enveloped him with it, a sad smile on her face. You bear a great burden and a heavy heart. I know the feeling. When the apes raided the temple years ago, I lost my mate, Cinder's father, in the attack, and the apes made off with Cinder's egg. In that one moment, I lost my whole world. It's thanks to Spyro, though, that I have a little bit of my world restored. Did you have family? Neil nodded. My mom died of cancer a few years ago. My father and brother, though, they both died in the war. Dad was helping a forward base when a bomb exploded near him. Danny, he went down with his plane in the middle of a desert trying to save some soldiers who were pinned down and suffering heavy casualties. I had oftentimes wondered why I survived so many horrible near-death instances. I just can't understand it. Constance nodded. We can never explain such things, try as we might. What we can do is remember the fallen and ensure that they did not die in vain. I know it was painful for you, but thank you for telling me. Neil chuckled. I should be thanking you. It's the first time I've spoken about the incident. I guess what they say is true. When you're hurting, get it all in the open. Constance gave a small smile. That's what Nova always told me as well. Well, I suppose that there are a few things our worlds have in common after all. Well then, I suppose we must be heading for Warfang now. Hunter has already informed me that he and Skylar will be traveling overland, but I have a feeling the other Guardians will want to see you immediately. As she said this, she turned broadside to Neil and lowered herself into a crouched position. This got the attention of the soldiers, and they didn't stay silent. Lady Constance, surely you do not mean to let this human ride you like some beast of burden? Constance huffed and eyed the soldier who spoke. Am I to assume that any of you wish to carry this human to the Guardians? It was my understanding that you lot were afraid of this human and would just as soon be rid of him as you would any other foe. I find myself curious and wanting to know more about his past. I am certain that a few of the other Guardians, once they overcome their shock, would be just as interested as I to learn all we can about humans. If I must carry him about, then so be it. Besides, I wish to ask him a few things while we fly, and I'd much rather have him close by rather than have to shout across to whoever else would willingly take him. After a moment, Neil was soon seated between Constance's shoulders on her back as she rose to take off. Neil turned to Skylar and Hunter. I'll see the two of you in Warfang. Skylar nodded to him, and Constance leapt into the air with one great flap of her wings. No sooner was the cheetah village out of sight than they were soaring among the clouds. To Neil it was similar, but at the same time different, and Constance climbed. She gave a glance back to him. So, Cinder told me that you humans had discovered how to fly. Tell me, how does flying like this compare to yours? Neil gave a smile and chuckled. There's no comparison. With humans, we use machines to fly. Some use helicopters like I used to, and some use planes and jets. With you, though, I can feel how your muscles shift and move with every flap, how you adjust for every little change in the wind. It's incredible. In a plane, which uses a fixed wing concept, you don't really feel much of anything except the occasional rough spot of turbulence. Neil didn't get a reply and shuddered, remembering what he had just said. Lady Constance? About before, please don't think me forward. At that moment Constance laughed, a rich and vibrant sound that suddenly put an image in Neil's mind of someone who enjoyed flying just for the hell of it. I've never had flying put in that perspective for me. So, you can actually feel every little movement I make? Neil blushed a bit and chuckled. Yeah. Constance smiled. Good. Well then,
What do you think about this? Neil had only a moment's warning before Constance shot up through the clouds and executed a perfect loop before coming back down into formation. The dragons around her looked exasperated at her antics, but at the same time smiled and chuckled to each other. Constance chortled. How was that? Neil chuckled. That the best you can do? Loop the loops? He meant it as a joke and Constance knew it, but she huffed, playfully indignant. All right then, you asked for it. As soon as the words had left her mouth, she folded her wings and dove. The wing from the descent threatened to rip Neil from her back, but he held on as the wind roared past. He found himself forced to close his eyes to keep them from drying out and clenching his jaw to keep his mouth shut and his cheeks from flapping. Then, she snapped open her wings and Neil felt as if every organ in his body slid down into his feet. He wanted to say something, but before he could even manage a syllable, Constance was off again, this time in a tight spiral as she climbed, and once she reached a suitable altitude, she started performing consecutive barrel rolls. Neil's blood was rushing to his head and his stomach felt like it was tying itself in knots. After a moment she leveled out and then gave another smirk back to him. So, how was that? Neil chuckled. I take it you like flying. Only a serious flyer takes time to perfect those maneuvers. I'll admit, if I hadn't been properly experienced as a pilot myself, you would have got me. He felt Constance shake as she laughed. That just takes all the fun out of it. But you're right. Up here, among the clouds, I can forget about everything. The duties, honors, and headaches about being a guardian. Everything that has been bugging me. Who's been bugging me? Neil chuckled. I heard that. Up here, it's just you and the wide blue yonder. I can't begin to tell you how often that, when I flew, I'd just sit up there, watching the clouds. I was never more at peace. Constance nodded and then started descending. Well, like the old saying goes, what goes up must come down. And for us, we are nearing Warfang. As to avoid a great stampede of people, we're landing just inside the noble quarter and we'll be working our way to the temple. Neil nodded. Sounds good to me. Awo. That last was said just as Constance and her group made the last descent through the clouds, revealing to Neil the majesty and sheer size of Warfang sprawled out before him. The city was massive. He'd been to some of the largest cities in the United States, but this one, he was sure, was bigger than most of them. Warfang had been extensively rebuilt and redesigned after the war. It had been 2 years since the last battle and some areas of reconstruction were still going on. Neil's gaze was drawn to a stretch of the city along the outer ring with very dilapidated houses. They looked out of place considering the buildings in what Constance informed him was the residential district. That stretch of buildings is the slum. I know it's not grand, but, well, the number of criminals in that area, plus the ineffectiveness of the watch in that area means that repairs are slow going. No mole wants to really build in that part of the city where one of their buildings may still be used as a safe house for criminals. About the only shining light in that place is the Full Moon Tavern, run by a wolf named Laika. Neil nodded and silently wondered how she knew about that when she dipped again. As a large inner wall and gate passed underneath, Neil spotted the reason she called this area the Noble Quarter. Each home was practically a manor house in and of itself. It would have been impressive to stand and admire the structures, but their landing had drawn some attention from the local residents. Several soldiers clad in shinier, more ceremonial armor than their escorts came to them, sneering haughtily. The leader, a large fire dragon who, judging from the modifications to his armor around the belly region, enjoyed his meals. He gave a lazy smile to Constance and then to the soldiers. Lieutenant, you and your group is dismissed. You may return now to that hole of a building you call a barracks. I think the slums have actually gotten worse since you left. The lieutenant growled low but said nothing except she saluted and then motioned for her group to follow her, and they took off, angling for the slums. The large red dragon then turned back. "Now then, Lady Constance, please permit us to escort you to what in the ancestors' names is that?" He had just caught sight of Neil as he stood alongside Constance. One of the soldiers glanced at Neil curiously and then looked back to him. "I think he's some kind of hairless ape, sir. Perhaps Lady Constance captured him and brought him for trial?" Another huffed. "Why bother with a trial? He doesn't look important enough. Just string him up and fling his body out over the wall, or better yet into the slums. They could use something to talk about." At that moment, Spyro and Cinder arrived and the dragons turned their attention to them. "Spyro, eh? Cinder, glad to see you're back. Look at this thing. Any idea where it came from?" Cinder caught how they hesitated on her name and sighed, which in turn made Constance give a wicked grin to the soldiers. "This ape, as you incorrectly called him, is under my protection as well, Spyro and Cinder's. Furthermore, you misunderstand, he is no ape. He is a human." The dragons froze where they stood. As one, slowly they turned to face Neil, each one examining him closely. One of the younger dragons actually drew close enough to smell him. Neil raised an eyebrow at that and chuckled. "Any closer you'll be able to read 'Made in Germany' on my coat tag." The dragon yelped and withdrew to his group, shock evident on his face. The lead dragon recovered and snarled. "Why is a human under a guardian's protection? In fact, why is a human even here?" The dragon had yelled that last part, and instantly Neil saw, out of the corner of his eye, several female dragons with their children in tow who, once they heard the dragon, they grew frightened. Constance had picked up on this and sighed. "That is a matter for the guardians and for the royals to assume. Now then, if you'll excuse us." With a huff, Constance took the lead with Spyro and Cinder coming along to Neil's left and right and giving him a reassuring nod. As soon as they were out of earshot, Constance looked back to him. "I assume you would like a chance to clean yourself up before we meet with the others. We'll stop by my home. Goodness knows I would like a chance to rest before having to deal with the inevitable headache to come." Neil looked to her curiously. "What do you mean? Those guards back there?" Their leader is the younger brother of Lord Vesuvius, a dragon with an almost intolerably short temper. He'll speak to his brother, who will then rush to the another, and then another, and before you know it, we'll have a mob of nobles at the gates. Once the nobles get stirred up about something, they won't let it die down easily." Neil sighed. "Sorry if I put you in a poor situation." Constance scoffed. "Think nothing of it. They know better than to try anything with me. Part of the reason I decided to take up their offer to live in the noble quarter was because I rather enjoy puncturing those windbags when they get a little too full of themselves." As they reached the manor, Neil breath caught at it up close. He had thought the buildings by the street were large, but this one was massive. As the group entered, they were greeted by an electric dragon who caught sight of Neil and made a gasp of alarm, but otherwise showed no outward signs of being startled. Constance, however, turned smoothly to the dragon. "Ampere, this is Neil. He's only going to be here for a moment while he cleans himself up and while I take a rest. In the meanwhile, please see to whatever Spyro and Cinder want or need." Ampere nodded understandingly and then directed his attention to Spyro and Cinder and paid Neil no more mind. Constance looked to him. "I assume your species bathes?" Neil nodded. Up the stairs, down the south hall there was a cough as Ampere turned. "It's the West Hall, my lady." Constance grimaced. "For the ancestors' sakes, this place is too big for my family and what few dragons I hire." "Fine. Down the West Hall, about 3 doors down, is the bathing chamber. Would you like me to see about getting a servant to buy a change of clothes for you? I would assume that a cheetah's garb would suit you." Neil shook his head. Thank you, Lady Constance, but that is unnecessary. I won't be long. Constance then gazed at him. Take all the time you want, please. With that she turned and vanished. Ampere glanced to Spyro and Cinder and then to Neil. Lady Constance is a dragoness who, unlike others, has no mind for politics. She prefers if the problem is out there before her and she can solve it. Otherwise, I'm afraid she gets headaches rather easily. Neil nodded understandingly and then followed the instructions he was given. Given that the manor was as big as it was, Neil had honestly expected a perhaps medium-sized bathroom but was awestruck again when he saw an immense pool in the middle of the room and then mentally slapped himself. Of course, what would a dragon do with a bathtub? They'd need a pool to clean up. Neil undressed, carefully undid his watch, and then slipped into the water which, to his surprise, was comfortably warm. He allowed himself a few moments just to soak in the heat and wash the dirt away that had accumulated in the past few days and gave his mind to wondering what things were like back in his world. Just then the water turned warmer and steam started to form. He realized he'd been thinking about that time he'd gone to some hot springs a long time ago. The pool must be enchanted to match the temperature to whatever the person currently bathing wants. With that in mind, he sank down to his neck in the warm water and allowed his mind to resume wandering freely. However, he was no longer alone. He was completely unaware of the door creaking open and a pair of eyes watching him. After a moment the figure slid into the room silently, and then, with Neil's back turned, slid into the water with barely a sound. Neil was suddenly aware of something. The water had gotten even warmer and the steam had turned thicker, almost like fog. As Neil decided to rise and leave, suddenly, a tail wrapped around his waist and pulled him back into the pool with a splash. For a moment the tail held him underwater until it then pulled him up and he was staring at a dragon, or rather from his current sight, dragoness. The tail gently set him back to the side but didn't release as the dragoness turned to face him. With the exception of being a little bigger and having a bit more finery about her, this dragoness was a mirror image of Cinder. She smiled as she saw Neil and released him from her tail only to spring and plant both forepaws on either side of him in a sort of hug, gently lay her body against his, slowly lowered her head, and gave him a long lick to the side of his face from his neck up to his cheek and chuckled coyly. Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm Shade, Cinder's big sister. This is the end for part 1. To get part 2, let's get at 20 likes on this video and comment part 2 to even faster upload.